Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in Black Elk Peak, South Dakota, last summer. What was supposed to be a rejuvenating solo hiking trip turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. One that still haunts me in my dreams and keeps me far away from forests and mountains. I had always been an avid hiker, finding solace in the wilderness after my divorce. The routine of the city had become suffocating, and I desperately needed to escape. Black Elk Peak, the highest natural point in South Dakota at 7,242 feet, seemed like the perfect destination. Remote enough to be peaceful, but established enough that a solo female hiker wouldn't be completely isolated. Or so I thought. I arrived at the Sylvan Lake trailhead on a Thursday morning in late June. The weather forecast promised clear skies for the next 4 days, perfect for my planned circuit through the Black Hills National Forest. I parked my Subaru Outback, shouldered my pack, and set off with a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in months. The divorce papers had been finalized just 2 weeks prior, and this trip was my personal ceremony of rebirth. The first day went exactly as planned. The trail was challenging but manageable, with spectacular views of granite spires and ponderosa pines that stretched endlessly across the rugged landscape. I passed a few day hikers and nodded politely, but mostly kept to myself, savoring the solitude. By late afternoon, I had reached my first campsite near a small creek that babbled soothingly as I set up my tent. That night, I built a small fire, ate my dehydrated pasta, and watched the stars emerge overhead, countless and brilliant in a way they never are in the city. I felt at peace, truly at peace, for the first time in years. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 10, listening to the night sounds of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m. I remember the time precisely because I checked my watch, confused by what had awakened me. The forest was eerily silent. No insects chirping, no distant rustle of nocturnal animals. Nothing. Just a heavy, expectant silence that pressed against my eardrums. Then I heard it. A whistling sound. Faint, but distinct. Not the wind, not a bird. It was melodic, almost like someone was whistling a tune. It stopped abruptly, and for a moment I convinced myself I had imagined it. Then it came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like footsteps crunching on the trail. "Hello," I called out. Immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Is someone there?" The whistling stopped. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even heavier than before. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped my tent with trembling fingers. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. I swept it back and forth, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been an animal, or simply the wind playing tricks in the canyon. I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, but rest eluded me for the remainder of the night. The next morning dawned bright and clear, chasing away the night's unease. I packed up early, eager to continue my journey and put distance between myself and the strange nighttime experience. The day's hike would take me deeper into the Black Hills, toward Little Devil's Tower, an unfortunate name that I tried not to dwell on given my experience the previous night. By midday, the temperature had risen considerably, and sweat trickled down my back as I ascended a particularly steep section of trail. I paused to take a drink from my water bottle, and that's when I noticed the scratches. They were on a tree trunk beside the trail, 3 deep, parallel gashes that cut through the bark and into the pale wood beneath. They were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. I've seen bear markings before. These were different. Too precise, too deliberate, too high up on the trunk to have been made by any local wildlife. I glanced around nervously, suddenly aware of how alone I was on this section of trail. I quickened my pace, telling myself there was a logical explanation. Perhaps a park ranger had marked the tree for some reason, or maybe it was another hiker playing a prank. Yet neither explanation felt satisfactory as I pushed deeper into the forest. Around mid-afternoon, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. In the middle of the trail lay a small pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle, with a larger stone in the center. It was clearly man-made, and recently, too, there was no dust or debris on the rocks. Someone had placed them there, and not long ago. I stepped around the formation, feeling increasingly uneasy. This was no longer coincidence. Someone was on this trail, perhaps watching me right now. I scanned the trees but saw nothing unusual, just endless pines and the occasional outcropping of granite. I debated turning back but realized I was now closer to my next planned campsite than to my starting point. Plus, retreating meant potentially walking back toward whoever was leaving these unsettling signs. I decided to press on but vowed to be more vigilant. As the afternoon waned, the sky began to darken prematurely. What had started as a clear day was now overcast, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I hiked. I reached my intended campsite near Cathedral Spires just as the first raindrops began to fall. It was a small clearing off the main trail, bordered on one side by a sheer rock face and on the other by dense forest. I quickly set up my tent, got my rainfly in place, and crawled inside just as the rain began in earnest. The downpour was intense, hammering against my tent with such force that I wondered if the fabric would hold. Thunder boomed overhead, and flashes of lightning illuminated my tent in brief, stark bursts. I had not anticipated a storm of this magnitude. The forecast had promised clear skies throughout my trip. I checked my phone, hoping for reception to check an updated weather report, but there was no signal. Not surprising given my location, but disappointing nonetheless. I had a satellite emergency beacon, but that was only for dire situations. A thunderstorm, while unpleasant, didn't qualify. As darkness fell completely, the storm showed no signs of abating. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, unwilling to venture outside to use my camp stove. The temperature continued to drop, and I pulled my sleeping bag around me, listening to the cacophony outside. Around midnight, the rain finally began to ease. The thunder became more distant, the flashes of lightning less frequent. I began to drift off to sleep, lulled by the gentle patter of raindrops that had replaced the earlier deluge. Then I heard it again, the whistling. The same tuneless melody I'd heard the night before, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps squishing in the mud outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath. The whistling continued, circling my tent slowly. Once, twice. On the third circuit, it stopped directly in front of my tent door. I could see a shadow through the fabric of my tent, a human silhouette, tall and motionless. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was certain whoever stood outside could hear it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly small and tremulous. No response. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity, then slowly, deliberately, moved away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the range of my hearing. I sat awake for hours, clutching my knife in one hand and my emergency beacon in the other. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or creak of branches made me flinch. But the whistler didn't return, at least not that night. Dawn came gray and misty. I emerged from my tent exhausted and on edge, half expecting to find more stone circles or tree markings. Instead, I found footprints, large boot prints in the mud surrounding my tent, exactly where I'd seen the shadow standing. They led away from my campsite, heading deeper into the forest. Off trail. I had planned to spend another 2 nights in the wilderness, but after this discovery, I made a new plan. Hike to the nearest trailhead and get back to civilization as quickly as possible. According to my map, I could reach the Willow Creek horse camp by nightfall if I pushed hard. From there, it would be a short walk to a road where I might be able to hitch a ride back to my car. I packed hurriedly, constantly scanning my surroundings. The forest felt different now. Hostile, secretive, full of hidden watchers. The fog hung between the trees like ghostly curtains, parting reluctantly as I moved through them. The trail to Willow Creek was more difficult than I'd anticipated. The previous night's rain had turned sections into slippery mud, and twice I nearly lost my footing on steep descents. By noon, I realized I was making slower progress than I'd hoped. At this rate, I wouldn't reach the horse camp until well after dark, a prospect that filled me with dread. As I paused to check my map and recalculate my route, I noticed something odd hanging from a branch about 20 feet off the trail. I squinted through the fog, trying to make it out. It looked like clothing? Curious, despite my fear, I ventured off the path for a closer look. It was a jacket, a red windbreaker, similar to the one I was wearing, suspended from a high branch by its hood. It swayed slightly in the gentle breeze, dripping rainwater onto the forest floor below. As I approached, I saw that it wasn't just hanging there by chance. It had been deliberately placed, the hood carefully threaded over a broken branch stump. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the damp air. This was no coincidence. Someone knew I was here, knew what I was wearing, and wanted me to know they were watching. I backed away quickly, returning to the trail and increasing my pace to a near jog despite my heavy pack. The hours blurred together as I pushed on, driven by an increasing sense of urgency. The fog never lifted, instead seeming to thicken as the day progressed. Twice I had to stop and check my map and compass to ensure I was still on the right path. Each time, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being observed, though I saw no one. By late afternoon, I realized with dismay that I had miscalculated. I was nowhere near the horse camp and darkness would be falling soon. I would have to make camp again, spend another night in the wilderness with whoever or whatever was stalking me. I found a small clearing that offered some visibility in all directions and set up my tent with numb fingers. This time, I gathered rocks and placed them in a perimeter around my campsite. Not that they would stop anyone, but at least I might hear if someone approached. As I worked, I became aware of a strange smell, faint at first, then stronger. It was an odd combination of wet earth, something metallic like blood, and an underlying sweetness that reminded me of rotting fruit. It seemed to emanate from the forest to the north of my campsite. Curiosity warred with fear. Part of me wanted to investigate, to confront whatever was out there rather than waiting for it to come to me in the night. The more sensible part insisted that I finish securing my camp and stay put until morning. In the end, curiosity won. I took my knife and flashlight, though there were still a few hours of gloomy daylight left, and headed cautiously in the direction of the smell. The forest grew denser as I moved away from the trail. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, their branches creating a canopy that further dimmed the already fading light. The fog swirled around my legs as I walked, as if trying to hold me back. The smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. I pulled my bandana up over my nose, breathing through my mouth as I pushed forward. Then I saw it, a small clearing ahead, visible through the trees. Something dark hung from a branch in the center. My steps slowed as I approached the edge of the clearing. I stood half-hidden behind a massive pine, peering into the space beyond. What I saw there turned my blood to ice. Suspended from a sturdy branch was a deer carcass, but not just killed and hung like a hunter might. This deer had been arranged. Its belly had been slit open, its entrails removed and carefully draped around the clearing like grotesque garlands. Its eyes had been removed, the empty sockets now filled with small white flowers I didn't recognize. Its legs had been broken and reset at unnatural angles, bound in place with what looked like human hair. But worst of all was what had been placed inside the cavity of its chest, visible through the gaping wound where its heart and lungs should have been. A photograph. My photograph. A selfie I had taken just yesterday at the trailhead, smiling and unaware of what awaited me in these woods. I stumbled backward, a scream building in my throat that I desperately swallowed back. Whoever had done this was beyond disturbed. They were dangerous in a way I couldn't begin to comprehend, and they had been following me from the very beginning. I turned to run and came face to face with an old woman. She stood not 3 feet away, motionless and silent. I hadn't heard her approach, hadn't sensed her presence until she was right in front of me. She was small and wiry, dressed in layers of mismatched clothing despite the summer weather. Her face was deeply lined, weathered like old leather, and her eyes were pale, almost colorless, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. "Not in these woods. Not now." "Who are you?" I managed to ask, fingers tightening around my knife, though I kept it hidden at my side. "Locals call me Agnes," she replied. "I watch these forests. Have for decades. I warn the ones I can." "Warn them about what?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "About him, the one who whistles, the one who marks the trees and arranges the stones." She gestured toward the mutilated deer. "The one who leaves his Bart." A sound escaped me, half laugh, half sob. "Who is he?" Agnes's colorless eyes flickered to the forest beyond me, then back to my face. "He had a name once. Matthew Klein. Lived in a cabin near Iron Creek. Folks said he was odd but harmless, until they found what he'd done to those hikers back in '97. 6 of them. Cut up like that deer, but worse. Much worse." I felt sick, lightheaded. They caught him? A bitter smile twisted Agnes's thin lips. They found him, dead by his own hand in that cabin, throat cut ear to ear, sitting in a circle of stones with all the trophies he'd collected arranged around him. She leaned closer, and I caught her scent, wood smoke and herbs. But these woods, they remember, and some things, once they've tasted blood, never really die. I wanted to dismiss her words as the ramblings of a disturbed old woman, but after what I'd seen, after what I'd experienced, I couldn't. "You need to leave," Agnes continued urgently. "Now, tonight. Don't wait for morning." "It's already getting dark," I protested. "The trails—" "Better lost in the dark than found by him," she interrupted. "Head south. Stay off the trails. He watches them. There's a ranger station at the base of Iron Mountain. You can make it by midnight if you hurry." Before I could respond, she pressed something into my palm. A small cloth pouch that smelled strongly of herbs and something metallic. "Keep this with you. It won't stop him, but it might slow him down." Her eyes darted to the forest again. "Go. Now." With that, she turned and disappeared into the fog with surprising speed, leaving me alone with the mutilated deer and the growing darkness. I ran back to my campsite, terror lending me speed I didn't know I possessed. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching like grasping fingers, roots rising to trip my fleeing feet. By the time I reached my tent, I was gasping for breath, my face scratched from whipping branches, my hands trembling violently. I stuffed my sleeping bag and the bare essentials into my pack, abandoning the tent and everything else. Agnes's warning echoed in my mind. Don't wait for morning. I had my compass, my emergency beacon, my knife, and now this strange herb pouch. It would have to be enough. As the last glimmers of daylight faded from the sky, I oriented myself south and plunged into the wilderness, leaving the trail behind. The going was difficult from the start. Without a clear path, I had to navigate around dense thickets, over fallen logs, and across small gullies carved by rainwater. The fog clung persistently, reducing visibility to mere feet in some places. I kept my flashlight off, both to preserve the batteries and to avoid announcing my presence any more than necessary. The night sounds of the forest surrounded me. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the creak and groan of trees in the gentle wind. Normal sounds, natural sounds, yet each one sent a spike of fear through me. I had been walking for perhaps an hour when I heard it again, the whistling. Distant at first, then growing steadily closer, coming from behind me, following me. I increased my pace, no longer concerned with moving quietly. Fear propelled me forward, faster and faster, until I was running headlong through the forest, branches slashing at my face, roots threatening to twist my ankles with every step. The whistling kept pace, never falling behind, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, sometimes another, as if my pursuer was playing with me, hurting me. I realized too late that I'd lost my sense of direction in my panic. The fog and darkness had disoriented me, and without checking my compass, I had no idea if I was still heading south toward the ranger station Agnes had mentioned. I paused, breathing hard, and fumbled for my compass. As I pulled it from my pocket, I heard something that made my heart nearly stop, the distinctive click of a mechanism engaging, followed by a low, rhythmic ticking sound. I shone my flashlight on the compass and saw to my horror that the needle was spinning wildly, around and around, never settling. The ticking grew louder, and with it came a new sound, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. The fog thickened, swirling into almost humanoid shapes that formed and dissolved in my flashlight beam. "Who's there?" I screamed, past caring about revealing my position. "What do you want from me?" The chuckling stopped. The whistling stopped. Even the ticking of my broken compass fell silent. For a moment, the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Then a voice spoke directly behind me, so close I could feel cold breath on my neck. "I want what I always want, Laura." I whirled around, knife raised, but there was no one there, just swirling fog and darkness. "What everyone wants, really," the voice continued, now to my left. I spun again, slashing blindly with my knife. To be remembered, to be witnessed. The voice was male, with an odd, archaic quality to it, as if the speaker was struggling to remember how to form words. "I don't even know who you are," I said, turning slowly, trying to track the voice as it seemed to circle me. A chilling laugh. "Don't you? Agnes told you. Matthew Klein, the man who made art from flesh." "You're dead," I said flatly, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You killed yourself decades ago." "Did I?" The voice sounded amused now. "Then who has been following you? Who arranged the stones? Who hung that jacket so like your own? Who prepared that deer as a gift for you?" "You're not real," I insisted, backing slowly away from where I thought the voice was coming from. "You're just a story. A local legend Agnes uses to scare hikers." "Am I?" The fog parted, and he was there, a tall figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I could make out the outline of a man, but the details were obscured by shadow and mist. What I could see clearly, however, was the long, curved blade he held loosely in one hand. "Agnes is real enough," the figure continued conversationally, "though she doesn't tell the whole truth. She never mentions her part in it all, how she was the one who found me all those years ago, how she was the one who taught me the old ways, the blood ways, how disappointed she was when I couldn't continue our work." My back hit a tree, and I realized I'd been retreating without conscious thought. There was nowhere left to go. "You're lying," I said, though uncertainty had begun to creep into my voice. "She warned me about you." "Did she send you south?" the figure asked, taking a step closer. "Off the trails? Away from safety?" Another step. "Did she give you something? A charm, perhaps? To protect you?" My hand closed involuntarily around the herb pouch in my pocket. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier suddenly made horrible sense. It wasn't just herbs in there. "She's been my faithful servant for decades." Matthew, if that's who it really was, continued, now close enough that I could see his face. It was gaunt, with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes that reflected the beam of my flashlight with an unnatural red gleam, bringing me offerings, marking the worthy ones. Like you, Laura. So strong, so independent. Your essence will sustain me for months. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, the blade flashing in the beam of my dropped flashlight. I reacted instinctively, years of self-defense training taking over where conscious thought failed. I ducked under his swing and drove my knife upward, feeling a moment of resistance, then the sickening give of flesh parting under the blade. Matthew made a sound, not of pain, but of surprise. He staggered back, looking down at the knife protruding from his chest with an expression almost of curiosity. Black ichor, not blood, oozed from the wound. "Interesting," he said, his voice suddenly distant and hollow. "It's been so long since anyone fought back, since anyone drew my blood." He reached up and pulled my knife from his chest with a wet, sucking sound. The wound began to close immediately, the black ichor retreating back into his body. "This will make the art all the more meaningful," he said, advancing again, now holding both his blade and mine. I turned to run, but my foot caught in an exposed root. I fell hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. I rolled onto my back, gasping as Matthew loomed over me, both blades raised. In that moment of absolute terror, something Agnes had said came back to me. These woods, they remember. If that was true, if the forest itself was somehow connected to this horror, then perhaps... I pressed my palms flat against the earth beneath me and closed my eyes, focusing all my will, all my desperation into a single, silent plea. "Help me." For a moment, nothing happened. Matthew's shadow fell across me as he bent down, blades gleaming. Then I felt it, a tremor in the ground beneath my hands, a stirring in the air. The fog grew thicker, coalescing around us like a living thing. Matthew felt it too. He hesitated, looking around with the first expression of uncertainty I'd seen on his face. The tremor grew stronger. Around us, trees creaked and swayed, though there was no wind. The fog continued to thicken until I could barely see Matthew standing over me, his form wavering as if viewed through water. A new sound filled the forest, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. The air grew charged, crackling with energy. I felt it flowing through me, into me, filling me with a strength and clarity I'd never experienced before. I rose to my feet, no longer afraid. Matthew backed away, his face twisting into a snarl of rage and, yes, fear. "This is impossible," he hissed. "These are my woods, my domain." "No," I said, and my voice seemed to echo with other voices, older voices. They never were. The fog surged forward like a tidal wave engulfing Matthew. He screamed, a sound of pure, primal terror that cut off abruptly as the fog closed over him. For a moment, his silhouette was visible within the churning mist, thrashing wildly. Then he was gone, and the fog began to dissipate, thinning until only wisps remained, dancing between the trees like playful spirits. I stood there, trembling with exhaustion and residual fear, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and fear? But my knife lay on the ground where Matthew had stood, and beside it, something else. A small, withered object that looked disturbingly like a human heart, blackened and desiccated as if it had been buried for decades. I didn't touch either item. Instead, I retrieved my fallen flashlight, checked my compass, now working normally again, and oriented myself south. The overwhelming sense of malevolence that had permeated the forest was gone, replaced by an almost benevolent stillness. I walked through the night, no longer running, no longer afraid. The forest seemed to part before me, creating a clear path where before there had been dense underbrush. Twice I thought I glimpsed Agnes watching from a distance, her pale eyes reflecting my flashlight beam like a cat's, but she never approached. I reached the ranger station just as dawn was breaking, emerging from the forest as the first rays of sunlight gilded the eastern horizon. The ranger on duty took one look at my scratched face and torn clothing and ushered me inside, where I told a simplified version of my ordeal: getting lost, spending a terrifying night in the forest, finding my way to safety. I didn't mention Matthew Klein, or Agnes, or the strange fog that had saved my life. Some things are too incredible to be believed, too terrible to be shared. The authorities retrieved my abandoned gear the next day. They found my tent undisturbed and no sign of any disturbance in the surrounding forest. No mutilated deer, no stone circles, no scratched trees. Nothing to corroborate my unspoken story. But I know what happened in those woods. I know that something ancient and malevolent still lurks there, waiting for unwary travelers. And I know something else protected me. Something equally ancient but not malevolent. Something that is the forest itself, that remembers and watches, and sometimes, when properly asked, intervenes. I haven't gone hiking since that day. I don't know if I ever will again, but sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whistles around the corners of my house, I find myself pressing my palms against the earth of my small garden, feeling for that resonant hum, that sense of connection that saved my life in the Black Hills. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel it answer. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the summer of 2024, when my girlfriend Stephanie and I decided to take a week-long hiking trip through the Black Elk Wilderness in South Dakota's Black Hills National Forest. We'd been dating for almost 2 years, and this trip was meant to be a celebration of sorts. Stephanie had just finished her master's degree in environmental science, and I had recently been promoted at the architectural firm where I worked. Stephanie had always been the more adventurous one between us. With her dark, curly hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail and her keen, hazel eyes that seemed to notice every detail of the natural world, she possessed a confidence in the outdoors that I both admired and envied. I was more of a city person, comfortable with blueprints and computer models, less so with trail maps and compass readings. But I loved her, and I wanted to share in the things that brought her joy. "You'll love it, Rob," she had insisted while we planned the trip. "The Black Hills have some of the most beautiful terrain in the country. Black Elk Peak is the highest point east of the Rockies in North America. The views will blow your mind." I nodded along, trying to match her enthusiasm while silently hoping I wouldn't embarrass myself out there. I'd done some casual day hikes before, but nothing like the multi-day backcountry trek she was proposing. We arrived at the trailhead near Sylvan Lake on a Tuesday morning. The area was busier than I expected. Families taking photos by the lake, day hikers preparing for short excursions, and a few serious backpackers like us checking gear and studying maps. "We should make it to the Harney Range campsite by sunset," Stephanie said, adjusting the straps on her pack. Her eyes scanned the forested hills rising around us, a smile playing at her lips. "Then tomorrow we'll head toward Norbeck Pass." "Sounds good," I replied, already feeling the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and tried to focus on the positives. 5 days alone with the woman I loved, surrounded by nature's beauty, disconnected from emails and deadlines. The first few hours were pleasant enough. The trail wound through ponderosa pine forests, occasionally opening to reveal stunning vistas of granite spires and rolling hills stretching to the horizon. Stephanie pointed out different plants and bird calls, her knowledge making me see the forest as more than just a mass of trees and undergrowth. By early afternoon, however, my enthusiasm was waning as my leg muscles burned from the constant uphill climb. "Let's take a break," Stephanie suggested, noticing my labored breathing. We found a fallen log beside the trail and shrugged off our packs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustling of pine needles in the breeze. As I took a long drink from my water bottle, I noticed an odd sort of stillness descend around us. The bird calls ceased, and even the breeze seemed to die away, leaving an unnatural silence. "Do you feel that?" I asked. Stephanie frowned. "Feel what?" "It's too quiet all of a sudden." She cocked her head, listening. "Huh, you're right." But then she shrugged. "Probably just a hawk overhead. Small critters get quiet when there are predators around." I nodded, but couldn't shake the creeping sensation along my spine that we were being watched. I scanned the trees around us, but saw nothing amiss, just endless trunks stretching in every direction, creating shadowy corridors of forest that seemed to absorb sound. We continued our hike, and gradually the forest came alive again with chirps and rustles. I dismissed my earlier unease as the product of an overactive imagination and focused instead on keeping pace with Stephanie, who moved up the trail with enviable ease. By late afternoon, dark clouds began rolling in from the west and the temperature dropped noticeably. "That doesn't look good," I said, eyeing the approaching storm. Stephanie glanced at the sky, her expression turning serious. "No, it doesn't. The forecast didn't mention rain until Friday." She consulted her map. "Let's pick up the pace. We've got about 3 miles to the campsite." We quickened our steps as thunder rumbled in the distance. The first fat raindrops began to fall just as the trail crested a ridge, revealing a small plateau dotted with pines where several tent sites had been cleared. "Harney Range," Stephanie announced with relief. We weren't alone. An older man with a weathered face and a gray beard was sitting under a tarp strung between trees, tending to a small propane stove. He nodded as we approached. "Evening," he called over the increasing patter of rain. "You folks might want to get set up quick. This one's going to be a gully washer." We hastily erected our tent in a sheltered spot while the storm gathered force. Lightning flashed, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. By the time we had our gear inside and the rain fly secured, the downpour was torrential. "So much for cooking dinner," Stephanie sighed, spreading her wet jacket over her pack to dry. "I've got extra soup if you need it," called the old man from his camp. "Plenty to share." We exchanged glances and Stephanie shrugged. "Better than trail mix." We dashed through the rain to the stranger's tarp where he made room for us. Up close, I noticed his eyes were a pale blue that stood out against his tanned, wrinkled skin. He extended a gnarled hand. "Frank Blackwood," he introduced himself. "Been coming to these hills for 40 years. "I'm Stephanie, and this is Robert," Stephanie replied, accepting his handshake. "Thanks for the offer of soup." "No trouble," Frank said, stirring a pot of something that smelled savory and delicious. "Not many folks up here this time of year. Storm season." "The forecast didn't mention storms," I said, accepting a tin cup of steaming soup. Frank made a dismissive sound. "Forecasts. They don't understand these hills. The Dakota called this place Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, sacred ground." He gazed out at the rain. "They say the spirits here get restless sometimes. Weather changes quick when they do." I caught Stephanie's eye and saw her suppressing a smile. She had little patience for supernatural explanations. Her world was one of scientific certainty. Weather patterns, geological formations, ecosystems in balance. "You too heading to Black Elk Peak?" Frank asked. Stephanie nodded. "That's the plan." Then, looping back through Horseleaf Lake. Frank's expression changed subtly. "Might want to reconsider. There's a section of trail washed out near Norbeck Pass after the spring floods. Rangers haven't fixed it yet." "We didn't see any trail notices," I said. "Just happened last week. Big storm like this one?" Frank shrugged. "But I know another route, if you're interested. More scenic anyway. Takes you past the old Harney mining camp." "I've never heard of it," Stephanie said, her interest clearly piqued despite her skepticism of Frank's talk of spirits. "Not on most maps," Frank replied. "Abandoned in the 1890s after some trouble. But the cabins are still there, or what's left of them. Could be a good place to wait out the weather if these storms stick around." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, something in his tone making me uneasy. Frank's pale eyes fixed on mine for a long moment. "Story goes that the miners dug too deep. Found something they shouldn't have. Most folks don't put stock in such tales, though. Lightning flashed, momentarily turning the forest around us silver-white, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. I flinched involuntarily. "Struck close," Frank commented mildly, seemingly unperturbed. "Storm's right on top of us now." We finished our soup as the rain hammered down, making conversation difficult. Frank sketched the alternative route on Stephanie's map, marking the location of the old mining camp with an X. "Appreciate the soup and the tip about the trail," Stephanie said as we prepared to make a dash back to our tent. Frank nodded. "Watch yourselves out there. The hills have eyes, as they say." "What do you mean by that?" I asked, an inexplicable chill running down my spine despite the hot soup in my belly. Frank's weathered face creased in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just an expression. Sleep tight, folks." We ran through the downpour back to our tent, diving inside and zipping the entrance closed against the elements. The tent shuddered under the force of the wind and rain, but held firm. "Well, he was interesting," Stephanie said, toweling her hair dry. "You think we should take his suggestion about the alternative route?" She considered for a moment. "It might be worth checking out. If the trail really is washed out at Norbeck, we'd lose a day backtracking. And I wouldn't mind seeing that old mining camp. Could be historically significant." I nodded, though something about Frank's pale stare and his talk of the hills having eyes had left me unsettled. What did he mean about the miners finding something they shouldn't have? Stephanie rolled her eyes. "Oh, you know how these old local stories go. Probably some superstition about disturbing sacred ground or unleashing evil spirits. Every forest has its boogeyman tales." "I guess," I murmured, not entirely convinced. That night, I slept fitfully. The storm raged on, and in my half-waking moments, I could have sworn I heard voices carried on the wind. Distant, keening sounds that might have been cries of pain or sadness. Once, I jerked awake, convinced someone had called my name. Stephanie slept soundly beside me, oblivious to both the storm and my restlessness. I envied her pragmatism at that moment. Her mind wasn't plagued by imagined voices or vague forebodings. Morning brought a temporary respite from the rain, though the sky remained overcast and threatening. When we emerged from our tent, Frank's camp was gone. No tarp, no gear, no sign anyone had been there at all. "That's weird," I said, scanning the campsite. "You'd think we'd have heard him packing up." "Must have left at first light," Stephanie replied, though she looked puzzled too. "Storm was still pretty loud then. We probably just didn't notice." After a quick breakfast, we consulted the map with Frank's marked route. It led away from the main trail, following what he described as an old mining access path that wasn't on our official map. "What do you think?" Stephanie asked. "Standard route with possible washout or Frank's scenic detour?" Despite my lingering unease about Frank's sudden disappearance and strange comments, my curiosity about the abandoned mining camp won out. "Let's try Frank's route. If it doesn't work out, we can always backtrack." Stephanie smiled, clearly pleased by my adventurous choice. "That's the spirit." We broke camp and set off, looking for the faint trail Frank had described. At first, I thought we'd missed it. There was nothing but dense forest where the trail should have begun. But then Stephanie spotted a subtle break in the undergrowth, and sure enough, a narrow path led into the trees. The trail was overgrown but still discernible, winding through increasingly rugged terrain. The forest seemed different here, darker, the trees growing closer together, their branches creating a canopy that blocked much of the already dim daylight. Moss hung from the lower branches, and the ground was spongy with decades of accumulated leaf litter. "Not exactly a highway," I commented as we pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth. "But definitely a path," Stephanie replied. "Someone's used this recently. Frank, presumably." "Maybe." We hiked for several hours, the trail gradually climbing. The air grew noticeably cooler, and tendrils of mist began to wind between the trees. the silence was profound. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, not even the sound of wind through the branches above us. That sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. Several times I turned quickly, convinced I'd catch sight of someone following us, but there was never anything there, just trees and mist and shadows. By early afternoon, the mist had thickened into fog so dense that visibility was reduced to 20 feet at most. We moved slowly, careful of our footing on the increasingly rocky and uneven ground. "We should have reached the mining camp by now," Stephanie said, consulting the map with a frown. "According to Frank's marks, anyway." "Maybe we missed it in the fog," I suggested, though it seemed unlikely we could miss an entire camp of cabins, abandoned or not. As if in answer to our confusion, the fog ahead parted momentarily, revealing a dark shape looming against the grayness. As we approached cautiously, the shape resolved into a dilapidated wooden structure. A cabin, its roof partially collapsed and its walls leaning precariously. "I guess this is it," I said, surveying what became visible as we drew closer. Not just one cabin, but several, arranged in a rough semicircle around what might once have been a central yard. Now it was just a muddy clearing strewn with rotting timbers and rusted metal objects I couldn't identify. "Harney Mining Camp," Stephanie read from a weathered sign still clinging to one of the more intact structures. "Established 1878. We moved among the ruins carefully, aware of loose boards and protruding nails. Despite the fog and the general gloominess of our surroundings, Stephanie's scientific curiosity was aroused. She examined the construction techniques, the placement of the buildings, speculating about what each structure might have been used for. "This one was clearly the assay office," she said, peering through a glassless window at a room containing the remains of a large stone hearth and what looked like metal troughs. "And that larger building was probably the bunkhouse." I nodded, trying to share her enthusiasm, but something about the place felt deeply wrong to me. The silence was oppressive, the fog seeming to absorb every sound we made, and that sensation of being observed had intensified to the point where the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. "Do you think we should camp here?" I asked, hoping she would say no. Stephanie looked at the sky, what little we could see of it through the fog and trees. "It's still early, but with this weather, maybe we should. At least these cabins offer some shelter if the rain starts again." As if summoned by her words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. "The assay office seems most intact," she continued. "We could set up inside, out of the elements completely." I wanted to argue, to insist we move on despite the threatening weather, but I couldn't articulate why without sounding irrational. What would I say? That I had a bad feeling? That Frank's cryptic warnings and the eerie silence of the forest had me spooked? "Okay," I agreed reluctantly, "but let's check it thoroughly first." The assay office, as Stephanie had called it, was in better condition than the other structures. Its roof was mostly intact, and though its single room was thick with dust and cobwebs, it offered genuine shelter. The large stone hearth dominated one wall, and rusty implements hung from hooks nearby, tools of the assayer's trade for testing or samples. "We could even have a real fire," Stephanie said, examining the hearth. "The chimney looks clear." "I don't know," I said. "Old buildings like this, fire seems risky." "It's stone," she countered, "and it's getting cold. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Before I could respond, thunder boomed directly overhead, much closer than before, and the first heavy raindrops began to patter on the roof. "Decision made," Stephanie declared. "I'll gather some wood from that fallen timber outside while it's still relatively dry." While she collected firewood, I cleared a space in the center of the room, sweeping away decades of dust and debris with a branch. As I worked, my boot struck something solid buried in the dirt floor. Curious, I knelt and brushed away the soil, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a wooden door set into the floor, a cellar entrance. A rusted metal ring served as a handle. I hesitated, then curiosity overcame my apprehension and I pulled. The door resisted at first, then gave way with a groan of protesting hinges, revealing a black opening and the top of a crude wooden ladder descending into darkness. A blast of cold air wafted up from below, carrying a smell that made me recoil, a musty, organic odor reminiscent of wet earth and something else, something that triggered a primitive response of revulsion and fear. I was about to close the trap door when a sound emerged from the darkness below, a soft scraping, like something moving across dirt or stone. "Stephanie," I called, backing away from the opening. No answer. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, definitely coming from the cellar. Then silence. I stood frozen, staring at the black square in the floor when Stephanie's voice came from directly behind me, making me jump. "What did you find?" she asked, her arms full of broken branches. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, and silhouetted against the gray fog outside. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a renewed surge of fear as the scraping sound came again from the cellar. "There's something down there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Stephanie set down her armload of wood and approached the trap door, peering into the darkness. "Probably just a raccoon or a possum," she said. "This would make a perfect den." Before I could stop her, she pulled a flashlight from her pack and shone it into the opening. The beam illuminated a dirt-floored cellar about 8 feet square and 6 feet high. Empty shelves lined the walls, and a few broken crates lay scattered about. There was no sign of any animal. "See? Nothing to worry about," Stephanie said, though I noticed she made no move to climb down into the space. She played the flashlight beam over every corner of the cellar, revealing nothing but dirt, stone, and rotting wood. I was about to suggest we close the trap door and forget about it when the beam passed over something on the far wall. Markings of some kind, etched or painted onto the stone foundation. "Wait," I said. "Go back. There's something on that wall." Stephanie directed the beam at the spot I indicated. The markings resolved into crude symbols, circles, lines and shapes that seemed deliberate but foreign to me. "Interesting," Stephanie murmured. "Could be survey marks from the mining operation, or maybe graffiti from later visitors. They look older somehow," I said. The symbols stirred something in my memory. Similar designs I'd seen in a museum exhibit about indigenous rock art. Stephanie handed me the flashlight. "I'm going down for a closer look." "I don't think that's a good idea," I protested, but she was already lowering herself onto the ladder. "It's fine," she insisted. The archaeology nerd in me can't resist. These could be authentic Lakota symbols. I watched anxiously as she descended into the cellar, playing the flashlight beam around to guide her. When she reached the bottom, she turned toward the marked wall, studying the symbols intently. "These are fascinating," she called up to me. "Definitely not modern. They have the patina of age, some kind of pictographs." "What do they mean?" I asked, kneeling at the edge of the opening to keep her in sight. She traced the outlines with her fingers. "Hard to say without more context. There's a figure here that could represent a person, and these circular patterns might symbolize—" "Huh. What?" "They're warm to the touch," she said, sounding puzzled. "The stone around them is cold, but these marks are definitely warm, almost like they're—" She broke off suddenly with a gasp that turned into a strangled cry. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, then dropped to the floor, rolling to illuminate nothing but the dirt and the base of the wall. "Stephanie," I shouted, panic surging through me. "What's happening?" No response except a scuffling sound and what might have been a whimper. Without thinking, I swung onto the ladder and descended rapidly, almost falling in my haste. When I reached the bottom, I snatched up the flashlight and swung it around. Stephanie was pressed against the wall with the symbols, her body rigid, eyes wide and staring at nothing. Her mouth worked silently, forming words I couldn't understand. "Stephanie." I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "What's wrong? Talk to me." Her eyes snapped to my face, but there was no recognition in them, only naked terror. When she spoke, her voice was a harsh whisper that barely sounded like her at all. "They're still here, In the walls, in the ground. They never left. Who? Who's still here? I demanded, fear making my voice sharp. The hungry ones. The miners found them, woke them up, fed them. Her gaze drifted past me to the center of the cellar floor. So many bodies buried here. Their bones are speaking. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cellar's cold air. This wasn't like Stephanie, scientific, rational Stephanie who scoffed at ghost stories and had a logical explanation for everything. "We need to get out of here," I said, tugging at her arm. "Come on, let's go back upstairs." She resisted for a moment, still staring at the floor as if seeing something invisible to me. Then she blinked rapidly, and awareness seemed to flood back into her eyes. "Rob," she said uncertainly. "What? What happened?" "You tell me," I replied, relief mingling with lingering fear. "You were talking about the symbols being warm, and then you just checked out." She shook her head as if to clear it. "I don't remember. Just touching the wall and then nothing." She looked around the cellar with new wariness. "Let's get out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. I helped her up the ladder, then followed quickly, slamming the trapdoor shut as soon as I was clear. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the cabin's walls and roof with violent force. "We should move to another cabin," I suggested, not wanting to stay anywhere near that cellar. Stephanie nodded, her face pale. "My thoughts exactly." We gathered our packs and the firewood Stephanie had collected, then dashed through the downpour to the building she had identified as the former bunkhouse. Its roof had more holes, but it was farther from the assay office and its disturbing cellar. The bunkhouse was a long, rectangular building with the remains of wooden bunks built into the walls. We chose a corner where the roof was mostly intact and the floor seemed solid. I got a small fire going in a rusted stove while Stephanie spread out our sleeping bags. Neither of us mentioned what had happened in the cellar. I was afraid to bring it up, worried that discussing it might somehow make it more real. Stephanie seemed similarly reluctant, focusing with unusual intensity on mundane tasks like organizing our supplies and preparing a simple dinner of rehydrated camping food. As darkness fell outside, our little corner of the bunkhouse grew almost cozy. The stove provided warmth and light, and the steady drum of rain on the roof created a wall of white noise that was almost soothing. "Not exactly the scenic mountain views I promised," Stephanie said eventually, breaking a long silence. I attempted a smile. "It's an adventure, right? How many people can say they've camped in an abandoned 19th century mining town?" "True enough." She hesitated, then added, "About what happened earlier?" "You don't have to explain," I assured her. "I don't think I can explain," she admitted, hugging her knees to her chest. "It was like something pushed its way into my head, showed me things." "What things?" I asked quietly. She shuddered. "Darkness, hunger, ancient beings sleeping in the earth until the miners' picks disturbed them. Then, feeding." She shook her head violently. "It doesn't make any sense. I don't believe in any of that supernatural nonsense. Must have been some kind of hallucination, maybe from carbon monoxide or radon gas in that enclosed space." I nodded, wanting to accept her rational explanation. "That makes sense." "Of course it does," she said with forced confidence. "We'll head out first thing tomorrow, weather permitting. Stick to the main trails from now on." Outside, thunder cracked directly overhead, making both of us jump. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and for a moment I thought I heard something else in that howl. A voice, or voices, calling wordlessly. We turned in early, both of us exhausted from the day's hike and stress. Despite my fatigue, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind, every rumble of thunder kept me on edge. Beside me, Stephanie tossed and turned, occasionally muttering in her sleep. I must have drifted off eventually because I woke with a start to absolute silence. The storm had passed, and the first gray light of dawn filtered through the holes in the roof. Stephanie's sleeping bag was empty. "Steph," I called, sitting up and looking around the bunkhouse. No sign of her. I pulled on my boots and jacket and stepped outside. The mining camp was wrapped in thick fog, even denser than the day before. Visibility was down to just a few feet. "Stephanie," I called, my voice muffled by the fog. No answer. Trying to quell my rising panic, I walked slowly through the camp, calling her name repeatedly. Perhaps she'd just gone to answer nature's call and would return any moment. But as minutes passed with no sign of her, my worry deepened. On my third circuit of the camp, a flicker of movement in the fog caught my eye. A dark shape moving between the cabins. I changed direction, hurrying toward it. "Stephanie?" The shape paused, then continued moving away from me, toward the edge of the camp where the forest began. As I drew nearer, I could make out a human figure, but something about its movement seemed off, jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Stephanie, is that you? Wait." The figure stopped at the tree line and slowly turned. Through the swirling fog, I could just make out Stephanie's features, but her expression was blank, her eyes unfocused. Before I could reach her, she turned again and plunged into the forest. I broke into a run, fear giving way to desperate determination. Something was wrong with Stephanie. Very wrong, and I needed to help her. I followed her into the trees, immediately enveloped by fog so thick I could barely see the ground at my feet. "Stephanie, stop, please." Ahead, I caught glimpses of her moving through the mist, always just out of reach. She seemed to be following some kind of path, though I could discern no trail. The trees grew thicker, their trunks black and glistening with moisture, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. I don't know how long I pursued her through that white void, minutes or hours. Distance impossible to judge. The terrain grew increasingly steep and rocky. Several times I stumbled or slipped on wet stones, once falling hard enough to bruise my hip and scrape my palms raw. But each time I got up and pressed on, terrified of losing sight of Stephanie in this otherworldly mist. Eventually, the ground leveled out, and I realized we had reached a plateau of some kind. The fog thinned slightly, allowing me to see perhaps 30 feet ahead. Stephanie had stopped moving and stood facing away from me at what appeared to be the edge of a cliff. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Stephanie," I called softly. "It's me, Rob. Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out together. Just please, step away from the edge." She didn't respond or give any indication she'd heard me. When I was about 10 feet away, she spoke without turning, her voice flat and emotionless. "They're calling me. Down there, in the dark." "Who's calling you?" I asked, edging closer. "The hungry ones. They want me to join them." She took a small step forward, closer to the precipice. "No!" I lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back from the edge. She didn't resist, turning to face me with that same blank expression. Up close, I could see that her pupils were massively dilated, nearly swallowing the hazel of her irises. Her skin was cold and clammy to the touch, her breathing shallow. "Stephanie, listen to me. Whatever you're experiencing isn't real. We need to go back to camp, get our things, and get out of here." Something flickered in her eyes, a moment of awareness, quickly subsumed by that uncanny blankness. "It's too late," she said tonelessly. "They've chosen me, like they chose Frank." "Frank?" I repeated, confused. "What about Frank?" "He brings them new food, every season, hikers who stray from the main paths. That's why he sent us here." A horrible suspicion began to form in my mind. Frank Blackwood? The old man at the campsite? Stephanie nodded slowly. "He died in these hills 60 years ago. The hungry ones took him first, but they let him walk, to bring them more." I felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath my feet. My mind raced back to the previous evening. Frank's strange comments, his knowledge of trails not on any map, his sudden disappearance in the morning without a trace. "This isn't happening," I muttered, more to myself than to Stephanie. "This can't be real." "They're very old," Stephanie continued in that same detached voice. "Here before the Dakota, before anyone, sleeping until the miners woke them with blood and iron. Now they hunger always." As she spoke, the fog around us seemed to thicken and darken, transforming from white to a sickly gray. The air grew colder, and that feeling of being watched intensified to the point of physical pressure, as if invisible eyes were boring into me from every direction. "We're leaving," I said firmly, tightening my grip on her arm. "Right now." I began pulling her away from the cliff edge, back toward the direction I thought we'd come from. She moved with the same unsettling, puppet-like gait, offering neither resistance nor assistance. The fog swirled and eddied around us, sometimes thinning enough to reveal glimpses of our surroundings, sometimes thickening until I could barely see Stephanie beside me. The terrain seemed to have changed. Instead of the steep, rocky slope we descended, we were now walking across relatively flat ground strewn with small stones that crunched underfoot. After what felt like an hour of wandering, I was forced to admit a terrible truth. We were lost. The fog showed no signs of lifting, and without the sun visible, I had no reliable way to determine direction. The vague path I thought we'd been following had disappeared entirely. Desperation mounting, I stopped to check Stephanie's condition. Her eyes remained unfocused, her skin cold. She stood or walked as directed but showed no initiative or awareness of our predicament. "Stephanie," I said, cupping her face in my hands, trying to establish eye contact. "I need you to come back to me. I can't do this alone." For just a moment, something like recognition flickered in her eyes. Her lips parted as if to speak. Then a sound cut through the fog. A voice calling my name. "Robert! Robert Johnson!" I whirled around, peering into the gray void. "Hello? Who's there?" "Robert, over here." The voice was coming from somewhere to our right, a man's voice, vaguely familiar. "Come on," I said to Stephanie, guiding her in that direction. We walked perhaps 50 yards when a dark figure materialized out of the mist ahead. As we drew nearer, I recognized the weathered face and gray beard of Frank Blackwood. "There you are," he said, sounding relieved. "Been looking all over for you two." I stopped, keeping Stephanie behind me, suddenly wary. "What are you doing here, Frank?" "Same as you, I expect. Got turned around in this damned fog." He gestured at the thick mist surrounding us. "Happens every year about this time. Locals call it ghost weather." His pale eyes shifted to Stephanie. "Your lady friend okay? She doesn't look so good." "She's fine," I lied. "Just tired. We were heading back to the main trail." Frank nodded. "Good thinking, but you're going the wrong way. Camp's back this direction." He pointed over his shoulder with a thumb. "Found a shortcut back to Sylvan Lake, too. Can have you there by nightfall if we hustle." Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me not to trust this man. Stephanie's words echoed in my mind. He died in these hills 60 years ago. The hungry ones took him first, but they let him walk, to bring them more. "I think we'll find our own way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks anyway." Frank's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That'd be a mistake, son. Easy to get permanently lost in this fog. People vanish in these hills all the time." He took a step toward us. "Best stick together." "Stay back," I warned, retreating a step and pulling Stephanie with me. Frank stopped, then smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached his pale blue eyes. "She told you, didn't she?" he said softly. "When they touched her mind in the cellar, they always share the truth with the chosen ones." My blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." Frank's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "Sure you do, son. The hungry ones, the old things in the deep places. They were here before anyone, before the Dakota, before the first people even, sleeping until the miners woke them with their digging." He took another step forward, and I noticed something I hadn't before, a strange fluidity to his movements, as if his joints weren't quite solid. The fog seemed to cling to him, swirling around his form like tendrils. "Stay away from us," I said, my voice cracking with fear. "Your lady friend is already theirs," Frank said, gesturing to Stephanie. "She's been marked. But you, they haven't decided about yet. Could be they'll let you walk, like me, bringing them new food when the hunger rises. Not such a bad existence, all things considered." "You're insane," I whispered, though I knew with a bone-deep certainty that he was telling the truth, or at least what he believed was the truth. Frank shrugged. "Believe what you want. But you can't leave. Not now. The hungry ones are watching." As if to emphasize his words, the fog around us darkened further, and I became aware of movement in the mist. Subtle shifts and eddies that suggested large bodies moving just beyond the limit of visibility. Stephanie made a small, frightened sound beside me. The first indication she was still aware on some level of what was happening. Her fingers tightened on my arm. That small gesture of fear, of humanity, galvanized me. Whether Frank was a ghost, a hallucination, or just a deranged old man, I wasn't going to let him or anything else harm Stephanie. "We're leaving," I declared more boldly than I felt. "Right now. And you're going to stay right where you are." Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his pale eyes, a flicker of what might have been respect, or possibly amusement. "Got some spine after all," he murmured. "Good. You'll need it." He stepped to the side, clearing a path before us. "Go ahead then. Try to leave. It makes no difference to me. The hungry ones always get what they want in the end." Not trusting this sudden cooperation but seeing no alternative, I guided Stephanie past him, keeping as much distance as possible between us and the old man. As we passed, I caught a whiff of that same smell from the cellar, damp earth and something else, something rotten. I didn't look back as we walked away, half expecting at any moment to feel Frank's hands grabbing at us. But there was only the sound of our own footsteps and the eerie silence of the fog-bound forest. When I judged we'd put sufficient distance between ourselves and Frank, I paused to check on Stephanie. Her eyes were still unfocused, but some color had returned to her cheeks. "Steph, can you hear me?" She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting past me into the fog. "They're still watching." "Who? The hungry ones?" Another nod. "They're old, so old, and patient." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They don't need to chase us. They know these hills. Every path leads back to them eventually." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on practical concerns. "Which way is the camp? Our supplies?" Stephanie didn't respond to the question, simply staring into the mist with that same vacant expression. I took a deep breath, fighting down panic. First priority: get back to camp, retrieve our packs, and find the main trail. Even if I had to carry Stephanie, I'd get us out of these hills. With no better option, I chose a direction that felt right and began walking, guiding Stephanie alongside me. The fog remained thick, occasionally thinning enough to reveal glimpses of our surroundings: gnarled trees, moss-covered rocks, patches of scrubby undergrowth, before closing in again like a gray curtain. Time became distorted in that featureless void. We might have been walking for 20 minutes or 2 hours. I had no way to tell. My only certainty was that we should have reached the mining camp long ago if we'd been heading in the right direction. Eventually, the ground began to slope upward, and the trees thinned out. We were climbing again, though I had no memory of descending after our earlier ascent to the cliff edge. Had we somehow circled back? Or was this an entirely different area? The fog finally began to thin as we gained elevation, and I caught glimpses of a wider vista beyond. Rolling hills covered in dense forest stretching to a horizon obscured by low clouds. No sign of roads, towns, or any human presence. "I think we're getting above the fog," I told Stephanie, though I wasn't sure she was listening. "If we can get our bearings." I broke off as we crested the rise and found ourselves faced with a familiar sight: the dilapidated structures of the Harney mining camp, looking exactly as we'd left it. Our tent still stood in the corner of the bunkhouse, visible through the partially collapsed wall. No, I whispered. "That's not possible." Beside me, Stephanie stirred. "I told you," she said, her voice stronger than before. "Every path leads back to them." I turned to her, desperately hoping to see awareness in her eyes, some sign that she was truly back with me. Her gaze was clearer, focused on me rather than the middle distance, but there was something different about her expression, a coldness, a detachment that wasn't like her at all. "We need to get our supplies and find the main trail," I said, clinging to the practical in the face of the inexplicable. "The map, the compass, we can still find our way out of here." Stephanie smiled faintly. "If that's what you want to try." Her tone suggested she knew it was futile, but I refused to accept that. I guided her down the slope toward the camp, scanning our surroundings for any sign of Frank. The fog was patchy here, thick in some places and almost absent in others, creating a surreal landscape of shifting visibility. We reached the bunkhouse without incident and quickly gathered our belongings. I checked the map, oriented the compass, and plotted what should have been a direct route back to the main trail that would bypass the mining access path altogether. "This way," I said, pointing. 2 miles northwest to intersect with the Cathedral Spires Trail, then we follow that all the way to Sylvan Lake. Stephanie looked at the direction I indicated, then back at my face. "If you say so." Her apparent indifference troubled me, but I chose to interpret it as lingering shock rather than surrender to whatever influence had affected her in the cellar. I took her hand and led the way out of camp, following the compass bearing I'd established. The terrain was challenging, steep in places, thick with undergrowth in others, but I pushed forward relentlessly, checking the compass frequently to ensure we maintained our course. Stephanie followed without complaint, moving with an eerie grace that contrasted sharply with her earlier puppet-like gait. After what I estimated to be about an hour's hiking, we should have reached the Cathedral Spires Trail. Instead, we found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by pines, with no sign of any established path. "This isn't right," I muttered, checking the map and compass again. "We should have hit the trail by now." "Does it surprise you?" Stephanie asked, her voice oddly calm. I looked up at her, frustration momentarily overriding fear. "What's that supposed to mean?" "They won't let us leave," she said simply. "Not until they've decided." "Decided what?" "Which of us joins them and which of us walks." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this fatalistic stranger with the confident, scientific woman I knew. "Stephanie, listen to me. Whatever happened to you in that cellar, whatever you think you experienced, it wasn't real. There are no hungry ones, no ancient beings. It's just... I faltered, unable to provide a rational explanation for everything we'd experienced. The voices in the wind, the impossible fog, walking in circles despite following a straight compass bearing, Frank's unnatural movements and knowledge. Stephanie watched me struggle with a detached interest. "You'll understand soon," she said softly. "When they touch your mind, too." A rustling in the undergrowth made me whirl around. The fog was creeping back into the clearing, tendrils of gray mist curling around the tree trunks and sliding across the ground like living things. "We need to keep moving," I said, grabbing Stephanie's hand again. "Come on." I chose a direction at random and plunged ahead, no longer concerned with following any particular bearing, just desperate to keep moving, to not be swallowed by the encroaching fog. Stephanie came willingly enough, but I could feel her watching me, as if waiting for something inevitable to happen. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. Finally, I had to stop, bending over with hands on knees, gasping for breath. When I straightened up and looked around, I found we were standing at the edge of another clearing, one centered around a familiar weathered sign, Harney Mining Camp, established 1878. "No," I groaned, despair threatening to overwhelm me. "Not again." Stephanie's hand touched my shoulder, her fingers cold through the fabric of my jacket. "It's time to accept it, Rob. We're part of this place now." I jerked away from her touch, anger flaring. "No, I don't accept that. There has to be a way out." Her expression was almost pitying. The only way out is through them. Before I could respond, a sound echoed from the direction of the camp. A human cry of pain or fear, quickly cut off. "Someone else is here," I said, instantly alert. Stephanie nodded. Frank always finds more food when the hunger rises. Despite my fear, I couldn't ignore the possibility that another hiker might be in danger. I moved cautiously toward the camp, Stephanie following close behind. As we approached the assay office, the building with the cellar, I saw movement through one of the glassless windows, the silhouette of a person bending over something on the floor. I crept closer, peering through the window. Inside, Frank Blackwood knelt beside the open trapdoor to the cellar, his back to me. He was speaking in a low, soothing voice as if calming a frightened animal. "That's right," he was saying. "Just a little further. They're waiting for you. They're so hungry." I couldn't see who he was talking to, but a scuffling sound and a whimper came from the cellar opening. Frank reached down as if offering his hand to someone below. Without thinking, I burst through the doorway. "Stop!" Frank turned, and for a moment, his face wasn't a face at all, just a shifting mass of shadow with two pale points of light where eyes should be. Then he solidified, becoming once again the weathered old man we'd met at the campsite. "Ah," he said, as if my arrival was expected. "Come to join the party?" "Who's down there?" I demanded. "What have you done?" Frank smiled that empty smile. "Just helping another lost soul find their way, same as I did with you two." He gestured to the open trap door. "Want to say hello?" A hand appeared at the edge of the opening. A human hand, grimy and scraped, clutching desperately at the floorboards. It was followed by another, and then a head emerged, a young man with wild eyes and blood streaking one side of his face. "Help me," he gasped when he saw me. "Please." I rushed forward intending to pull him up, but Frank moved with impossible speed, positioning himself between me and the cellar opening. "Can't interfere," he said, his voice hardening. "The hungry ones have already begun." The young man screamed then, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly as he was yanked back down into the darkness with such force that his fingernails left gouges in the wooden floor. "No!" I shouted, lunging past Frank. I reached the trapdoor in time to see the young man being dragged deeper into the cellar by something. The flashlight I'd dropped during our earlier exploration still lay on the dirt floor, its beam illuminating a scene that my mind struggled to comprehend. The cellar no longer ended at stone walls 6 feet below. Instead, it opened into a vast, cavernous space that couldn't possibly exist beneath the small building. The walls of this impossible cavern were lined with the same symbols we'd seen earlier, now glowing with a sickly phosphorescence that cast everything in a ghostly light. And moving in that light were shapes, forms that seemed to shift between solid and insubstantial, their outlines suggesting bodies both human and not. They converged on the struggling young man, enveloping him in a mass of shadowy limbs and elongated fingers. I recoiled from the sight, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. Frank watched me with those pale, empty eyes. "Now you see," he said. "Now you understand." "What are they?" I whispered, unable to tear my gaze from the nightmare below. "I told you, the hungry ones, old as the hills themselves, sleeping until the miners broke through with their digging and woke them up." Frank gestured at the symbols glowing on the cavern walls. "The Dakota knew. They put warnings here, marked the place as forbidden. But white men don't heed such warnings, do they?" A terrible scream echoed up from below, lingering in the air even after it stopped. I pressed my hands over my ears but couldn't block out the memory of the sound. "Why are you helping them?" I demanded, glaring at Frank. He shrugged. "They let me walk, bring them food when the hunger rises, better than the alternative, which is joining them, becoming part of them." He nodded toward the open trap door. "Like your lady friend is about to do." I spun around to see Stephanie standing at the edge of the opening, looking down into the cavern with an expression of transfixed wonder. "Stephanie, no!" I shouted, lunging toward her. But I was too late. She stepped forward into emptiness, dropping into the cellar with the calm deliberation of a diver entering water. I reached the opening in time to see her land gracefully on the dirt floor below, then walk with steady purpose toward the glowing symbols on the far wall. "Stephanie," I cried, preparing to climb down after her. A hand clamped on my shoulder with inhuman strength. "Let her go," Frank said. "She's been chosen. It's an honor, in a way." I struggled against his grip but couldn't break free. "Let me go. I have to help her." "You can't help her now, but you might be able to help yourself." His voice dropped to a confidential murmur. "They only need one to join them, one to walk. That young fella, he was just food. But you and your lady friend, you've been marked for something more." Below, Stephanie had reached the wall with the symbols. She placed her hands against the glowing marks, and they seemed to ripple at her touch, like liquid disturbed by a stone. The shadowy forms that had surrounded the young man, who was now ominously still, turned toward her, reaching out with elongated limbs. "No!" I screamed, redoubling my efforts to break free. With a desperate surge of strength born of pure terror, I tore myself from Frank's grasp and half fell, half jumped down the ladder into the cellar. I landed awkwardly, pain shooting through my ankle, but ignored it, lurching toward Stephanie. The air in the cavern was thick and cold, smelling of damp earth and decay, making each breath a struggle. "Stephanie," I called, reaching for her, "don't do this. Come back with me." She turned at the sound of my voice, and I saw that her eyes had changed. The warm hazel completely swallowed by darkness, as if her pupils had expanded to fill the entire iris. "It's beautiful, Rob," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "They're going to show me everything, all the secrets of the deep places." "Whatever they're showing you, it's a lie," I insisted, moving closer despite the fear that made each step an act of will. The shadowy forms hovered at the edges of my vision, watching, waiting. "Please, Steph, I love you. Don't leave me like this." Something flickered in her face, a moment of recognition, of the woman I knew. "Rob?" I seized on that flicker of humanity. "Yes, it's me. I'm here to take you home." She blinked, confusion replacing the dreamy expression. "Home?" "Yes, back to our apartment. Your plants that need watering. The book you were reading, remember?" She frowned as if trying to recall something just beyond reach. I remember." "Take my hand," I said, extending it toward her. "Let's get out of here together." She looked at my outstretched hand, then over her shoulder at the glowing symbols. The shadowy forms drew closer, their movements becoming more agitated. "They don't want me to go," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't care what they want," I said firmly. "I'm not leaving without you." Stephanie hesitated, caught between two forces pulling her in opposite directions. Above us, Frank's voice drifted down from the opening. "They won't let you both go," he called. "One to join, one to walk. That's the bargain." I ignored him, keeping my focus entirely on Stephanie, willing her to take my hand. "I love you," I said again. "Please." With visible effort, she lifted her hand toward mine. Our fingers were inches apart when a change came over the cavern. The air grew suddenly colder, the symbols on the wall pulsing with increased intensity. The shadowy forms surged forward, no longer content to watch from the periphery. "They're angry," Stephanie said, her eyes widening with renewed fear. "Then let's not stick around," I replied, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the ladder. We had taken no more than 3 steps when the ground beneath us trembled. Dust and small stones rained down from above as the entire structure of the assay office shook with the force of some subterranean disturbance. "Run!" I shouted, dragging Stephanie toward the ladder. We scrambled up the wooden rungs as the cavern behind us filled with a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. A chorus of inhuman voices raised in what might have been rage or hunger or both. The trap door was still open above us, and through it I could see Frank backing away, his weathered face twisted in an expression of naked fear. "What have you done?" he cried as we emerged from the cellar. "They'll take us all now." The entire building was shaking, timbers creaking and groaning as if under enormous pressure. Outside, I could hear trees snapping and the rumble of disturbed earth. "Move!" I shouted at Frank, pulling Stephanie toward the door. "The whole place is coming down." We burst out of the assay office into chaos. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, but through it I could see trees bending and falling as if pushed by invisible forces. The ground rippled in places, cracks appearing in the earth. "The packs!" Stephanie cried, suddenly sounding more like herself. "No time," I replied, pulling her away from the collapsing buildings of the mining camp. Frank stumbled after us, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by the terror of a man who knows his protectors have turned against him. "You broke the bargain," he moaned. "You broke the bargain." We ran blindly through the fog, guided only by the need to put distance between ourselves and the disintegrating camp. The ground continued to shake beneath our feet, making every step treacherous. A terrible rending sound came from behind us, followed by Frank's scream, a sound of pure human terror that cut off as suddenly as it had begun. I didn't look back, focusing only on keeping Stephanie's hand in mine as we fled through the forest. The fog swirled around us, sometimes thinning enough to reveal glimpses of our surroundings: trees torn from the ground, great cracks in the earth, rocks tumbling down slopes, before closing in again. The sounds of destruction gradually faded behind us, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. I have no idea how long we ran or how far. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to slow to a walk and finally to stop altogether. We collapsed against the trunk of a massive pine, both gasping for breath. "Do you think we're safe?" Stephanie panted. I shook my head, too winded to speak. The truth was, I had no idea if we'd escaped or simply been allowed to flee. The memory of those shadowy forms in the cavern, of Frank's final scream, suggested that nothing about this place was safe. As our breathing slowed, I noticed that the fog was beginning to thin. Through the dissipating mist, I could make out what appeared to be a man-made trail cutting through the forest ahead of us. "Look," I said, pointing. "A trail, a real one." Stephanie followed my gaze, her expression hopeful for the first time since this nightmare began. "Could be the cathedral spire's trail." We struggled to our feet, supporting each other as we made our way to the path. It was indeed a properly maintained hiking trail, complete with occasional markers nailed to trees. "Cathedral spires, 2.4 miles. I read from one of the signs, relief flooding through me. "We can follow this all the way back to Sylvan Lake." Stephanie squeezed my hand, and I looked at her properly for the first time since our escape from the cellar. Her eyes were back to their normal hazel, though shadowed with fatigue and lingering fear. But there was awareness in them now, recognition when she looked at me. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not leaving me." I pulled her into a tight embrace, burying my face in her hair. "Never." We followed the trail with single-minded determination, neither of us suggesting a rest despite our exhaustion. The fog continued to thin as we walked, eventually disappearing altogether to reveal a clear afternoon sky. The forest around us seemed normal again, birds calling, squirrels chittering, wind rustling through pine needles. By the time we reached Sylvan Lake, the sun was low in the sky, casting golden light across the water. The parking lot was crowded with tourists and day hikers, the mundane normalcy of the scene almost shocking after what we'd experienced. We found our car where we'd left it and drove straight to the nearest ranger station, where we reported being lost in the fog and separated from our equipment. We mentioned nothing about the mining camp, the cellar, or Frank. Who would believe us? The ranger nodded sympathetically. "Happens more often than you'd think. The weather up there can turn on a dime, especially this time of year. Fog rolls in, people get disoriented. Have you ever heard of a place called Harney Mining Camp?" Stephanie asked, unable to resist. The ranger frowned thoughtfully. "Old mining settlement from the gold rush days?" Yeah, there are ruins up there somewhere. Not much left, I'm told. Never been there myself. It's well off the marked trails." We exchanged glances but said nothing more. That night, in a motel room in Rapid City, we finally talked about what had happened. Stephanie remembered everything. The symbols in the cellar, the voices in her head, the pull toward the cavern and the entities within it. "It wasn't a hallucination," she said quietly, sitting cross-legged on the bed. "Not carbon monoxide or radon gas or any other rational explanation. Those things were real." I nodded, unable to deny the truth of what we'd both experienced. "But what were they?" "I don't know if there are words for it in any human language," she replied. "Ancient, hungry, patient. Frank said they were there before the Dakota, before anyone." "Do you think they're still there?" I asked. "Under the camp?" She shuddered. "I hope not. That earthquake or whatever it was, maybe it collapsed their cavern, buried them deeper." I wanted to believe that, but something told me it wouldn't be so simple. Entities that had existed for countless millennia wouldn't be destroyed by a single geological event. "What about Frank?" I asked. "Was he real?" "In a way," Stephanie said. "I think he was what they promised I would become. A lure, someone who could walk in the world of the living but was bound to them, compelled to bring them new victims." "One to join, one to walk," I murmured, recalling his words. "Yes." She reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "They nearly had us, Rob. If you hadn't come after me." I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I'd failed to reach her in time. "It's over now," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. We had escaped the physical location, but something of that place had come with us. A knowledge that couldn't be unlearned, a doorway in our minds that couldn't be fully closed. That night, we both dreamed of symbols glowing on stone walls, of shadows moving in darkness, of voices calling from deep places. We woke simultaneously in the pre-dawn hours, instinctively reaching for each other. "They're still with us, aren't they?" Stephanie whispered. "In here." She tapped her temple. I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. I think maybe they always will be." We checked out of the motel that morning and drove east, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the Black Hills. But sometimes, in the darkness before dawn, I still wake to the sensation of being watched by patient, hungry eyes. And I wonder if somewhere in South Dakota, a hiker is meeting a weathered old man, or perhaps a young couple, who knows the location of trails not found on any map. And I wonder which of us is truly walking and which has joined. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote western edge of the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota, not far from the Wyoming border. I've always considered myself a practical man. Working as an accountant in Sioux Falls doesn't exactly prepare you for the unexplainable, but it does teach you to trust in order, in patterns, in the reliability of numbers. Everything adds up eventually. At least, that's what I used to believe. My girlfriend, Melissa Scott, had been begging me to take a vacation for months. We'd been dating for 2 years, and she often complained that I was married to my spreadsheets. She wasn't entirely wrong. Tax season had been brutal, and even after April 15th, I found myself working late, my eyes burning from staring at columns of numbers for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. "You need fresh air," she'd insisted, gently closing my laptop one evening in early June. Real mountains, stars, silence. She showed me photos of Deerfield Lake, a remote spot in the Black Hills where her family used to camp when she was young. "It's beautiful in the summer," she said, her eyes lighting up with nostalgia. "And there's a loop trail that goes deep into the forest. Hardly anyone takes it because it's not well marked." The thought of being disconnected from email for even a day made me anxious. But Melissa had planned everything. She'd even convinced our friend Dylan Wright to join us, a wilderness enthusiast who'd been trying to get me to go hiking for years. "Come on, Thomas," Dylan had said when I called to confirm. "When was the last time you saw the Milky Way? When was the last time you heard absolutely nothing but wind in the trees?" I couldn't remember. The drive from Sioux Falls took nearly 5 hours. Melissa navigated while I drove, the landscape gradually transforming from flat prairie to the rounded, pine-covered peaks of the Black Hills. Dylan followed in his Jeep, loaded with camping gear I didn't own and wouldn't have known how to use. Deerfield Lake was even more beautiful than Melissa's photos suggested. The water was a deep blue mirror reflecting the surrounding pines and rocky outcrops. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the campground was surprisingly empty for June. "Midweek in June is perfect," Melissa explained as we set up our tents in a site tucked back against the trees. "Too late for spring breakers and too early for summer vacation crowds." Dylan seemed pleased with my choice of location, a flat area with a natural windbreak of pines, about 30 yards from the lake shore. He busied himself with setting up the fire pit while Melissa and I wrestled with our tent. By sunset, we had a comfortable camp established. 2 tents, a cooking area, and chairs arranged around a crackling fire. To disconnecting, Dylan raised his beer bottle as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the hills. "To disconnecting," Melissa and I echoed. That first night was peaceful. We talked about nothing important: Dylan's job as a high school biology teacher, Melissa's latest photography projects, and my complete inability to identify any constellations beyond the Big Dipper. The stars were incredible, an overwhelming blanket of light against perfect darkness. I hadn't realized how much city light pollution had robbed me of this view. "Tomorrow," Dylan said as we prepared for bed, "we should take the Reynolds Creek Trail. It's about 7 miles round trip, mostly along an old logging road before it branches off into the forest. There's supposed to be an abandoned mining cabin somewhere along the way." "How do you always know these things?" I asked. He shrugged. "I do my research. Plus, I talked to a ranger when I stopped for maps last week." Sleep came easily that night, easier than it had in months. The sound of wind in the pines and the gentle lapping of water against the lake shore was better than any white noise machine I'd ever tried. I woke before dawn to the sound of something moving outside our tent. The soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles circled our campsite. "Melissa," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. She murmured, still half asleep. "I think there's something outside." She rolled over, pulling the sleeping bag over her head. "Probably just a deer." The footsteps continued circling, deliberate and slow. Definitely not a deer. Too heavy. Maybe a bear. My heart quickened as I realized I had no idea what to do if we encountered a black bear. Make noise? Play dead? Run? I reached for my phone to check the time, 4:52 a.m., and noticed there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent. I held my breath. Something brushed against the nylon wall, a subtle pressure that moved from one side to the other, as if someone were running their hand along the fabric. Then, silence. I waited, straining to hear anything besides Melissa's steady breathing and my own thundering heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The forest was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. Our campsite appeared untouched. No scattered supplies, no sign of animal intrusion. Dylan's tent stood silent across the fire pit. The embers of last night's fire had long since died, leaving only a pile of white ash. Something felt wrong, though. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Complete silence. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, no early bird calls. Just a dense, expectant quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. A branch snapped in the woods behind our site, and I quickly zipped the tent closed again. Probably just my imagination running wild. I wasn't used to camping, to the random sounds of wilderness at night. I lay back down, but sleep eluded me until the first rays of light filtered through the tent fabric. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" I asked Dylan as we prepared breakfast over the campfire. "Like what?" He flipped bacon in a cast iron pan. "I don't know. Footsteps, maybe? Around 5 a.m.? Dylan shook his head. "Slept like a rock. But there are deer everywhere around here. Could have been one checking us out." Melissa emerged from the tent, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. "Thomas thought he heard the Blair Witch last night," she teased, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the percolator. "Laugh all you want," I said, "but something was definitely circling our tent." "Speaking of creepy things in the forest," Dylan said, "I've been reading about local legends. Did you know the Dakota considered parts of the Black Hills sacred and forbidden?" "The whole area is sacred to them," Melissa corrected. "Yes, but Reynolds Creek specifically has stories attached to it. They called it the place where shadows walk upright." I nearly choked on my coffee. "And you still want to hike there?" Dylan grinned. "Absolutely. The stories are the best part." After breakfast, we packed our day packs with water, trail mix, sandwiches, and first aid supplies. Dylan had a topographic map of the area and a compass, though he assured us the trail was straightforward enough. "It follows the creek most of the way," he explained as we set out, then cuts east through a stand of old-growth pines before looping back. The morning was glorious, cool and clear with sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. Reynolds Creek bubbled alongside the trail, a clear mountain stream rushing over smooth stones. For the first time in months, I felt the knots in my shoulders begin to loosen. Melissa walked ahead, occasionally stopping to photograph wildflowers or interesting fungi. Dylan pointed out animal tracks, deer, raccoon, and what might have been coyote. "This is actually nice," I admitted after we'd been walking for about an hour. I'd forgotten what it feels like to not be hunched over a desk. "Nature's the best medicine," Dylan replied, "although you might change your tune when the blisters start." We reached a fork in the trail around noon. The main path continued alongside the creek, while a narrower track branched off eastward into denser forest. "That's our turn," Dylan said, consulting his map. "Should be about 2 miles to the old mining cabin, then the trail loops back to the main route." The side trail was notably less maintained, thin enough that we had to walk single file, with branches occasionally scraping our arms. The cheerful sound of running water faded behind us, replaced by the hushed quiet of deep forest. "It's so still here," Melissa said softly, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. She was right. The density of the trees blocked much of the wind, creating a pocket of stillness. Even our footsteps seemed muffled on the carpet of pine needles. After another mile, the trail began to climb more steeply. I was breathing heavily, unused to the exertion and the altitude. Sweat soaked through my t-shirt despite the cool air beneath the canopy. "How much farther?" I called to Dylan, who had pulled ahead. "Should be just over this rise," he replied. "According to the map, there's a small clearing with—" He stopped abruptly as he crested the hill. Melissa and I hurried to catch up. The trail opened onto a small meadow ringed by towering pines. In the center stood what remained of a crude log cabin, little more than 3 crumbling walls and a partially collapsed roof. What had once been a stone chimney was now just a pile of scattered rocks. "Reynolds' cabin," Dylan said, referring to his map, "built in 1891 by a silver prospector named Harold Reynolds, abandoned after the winter of 1893. "What happened to him?" I asked. Dylan shrugged. "Map doesn't say. Local museum might know." We approached the ruins cautiously. The wood was silver gray with age, and what remained of the door hung askew on a single rusted hinge. Inside, the dirt floor was covered with decades of fallen leaves and pine needles. A crude table made from a split log still stood in one corner, and the remnants of a bed frame occupied another. "Hard to imagine someone living out here, especially through the winter," Melissa said, running her hand along one weathered wall. "People were tougher back then," Dylan replied. I wandered around the perimeter of the clearing while they explored the cabin. The meadow grass was dotted with late spring wildflowers, white starbursts and tiny purple blooms I couldn't name. At the far edge, I noticed something odd. A circle of stones, each about the size of a loaf of bread, arranged in a perfect ring about 6 feet in diameter. "Hey guys," I called. "Come look at this." Dylan examined the stone circle with interest. "Could be old fire pit, or maybe something the Dakota left." "Or teenagers," Melissa suggested. "Maybe," Dylan conceded, "but these stones are heavy, and they're buried pretty deep. Would take effort to place them like this." Something about the circle made me uneasy, though I couldn't have explained why. Part of me wanted to dismantle it, to kick the stones apart, but another part, a deeper, more primitive instinct, warned against touching them at all. "Let's have lunch," Melissa suggested, breaking the strange tension. We sat on fallen logs near the cabin ruins and ate our sandwiches. The sun had passed its zenith, and the clearing was warm despite the cool forest air. After eating, Melissa stretched out on a patch of grass to soak up the sunshine, while Dylan sketched the cabin ruins in a small notebook he carried. I must have dozed off sitting against a tree trunk. When I opened my eyes, the quality of light had changed. Softer, more golden. The sun was well on its way toward the western horizon. "What time is it?" I asked, disoriented. Dylan checked his watch. "Almost 5. We should head back soon if we want to reach camp before dark." I frowned, checking my own watch. 4:52 p.m. "We've been here for over 4 hours? That can't be right." Melissa sat up, brushing grass from her hair. "I didn't mean to nap that long." "The altitude can do that," Dylan said, though he looked puzzled too. "Makes you sleepy." We packed up quickly. As Dylan consulted his map to confirm our return route, I glanced back at the stone circle at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, just the briefest flash in my peripheral vision, I thought I saw a figure standing inside it, tall and unnaturally thin, like a shadow stretched vertical. When I turned to look directly at it, nothing was there. "Did you see that?" I asked Melissa, who was adjusting her backpack straps. "See what?" "I don't know. Something by the stones." She looked over. Just trees moving in the wind. But there was no wind, not in the clearing. The air was perfectly still. The return journey started uneventfully. We followed the narrow trail back the way we had come, moving at a quicker pace than before, aware of the shortening day. The forest seemed different somehow. The shadows deeper, the silence more absolute. "Does it seem darker to you?" I asked after we'd been walking about 20 minutes. "We're losing light," Dylan replied, but I noticed he'd quickened his pace. Another 10 minutes and I was certain something was wrong. The trail should have rejoined the main path by now, bringing us back to the welcome sound of Reynolds Creek. "Dylan," Melissa called from behind me, "is this right? I don't remember this section." We'd entered a part of the forest where the pines grew so densely that their branches interlocked overhead, creating a twilight gloom despite the fact that sunset was still an hour away. The ground was covered with a thick carpet of rust-colored needles that deadened our footsteps. Dylan stopped, pulled out his map and compass, and frowned. "We should have hit the junction already." He studied the compass, then looked up at the canopy, trying to get a bearing from the sun. "Are we lost?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "No," he said too quickly. "Just a bit off track. The main trail should be west of here." He pointed to our right. "Let's cut through. We'll intersect it." Leaving the path made me nervous, but I trusted Dylan's outdoors experience. We pushed through undergrowth and around tree trunks, heading in what Dylan assured us was a westerly direction. After about 15 minutes of difficult progress, we emerged onto another trail, but it wasn't the main path we'd been seeking. "This isn't right," Melissa said, voicing what we were all thinking. The trail before us was barely discernible, more like a game path than anything made for human travel. It twisted away between the trees, quickly lost in shadows. Dylan consulted his map again, turning it this way and that as if it might suddenly reveal new information. "I don't understand," he muttered. "We should be right here." He pointed to a spot on the map where the side trail reconnected with the main path. "Let me see," I said, taking the map from him. It was detailed enough, showing contour lines, creek beds, and marked trails. According to the map, we should indeed have reached the junction by now. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere," Melissa suggested, though we all knew there had been no other turns to take on the narrow path from the cabin. "Let's try following this," Dylan decided, gesturing to the faint trail before us. "It has to go somewhere." With no better options, we continued along the unfamiliar path. The forest grew darker still, and I found myself checking my watch repeatedly. 5:23 p.m., 5:47 p.m., 6:10 p.m. The sun would set around 8:30 this time of year, giving us a little over 2 hours to find our way back. "Listen," Melissa said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. At first, I heard nothing, just the oppressive silence of the dense forest. Then, faintly, the sound of running water. "The creek," Dylan said, relief evident in his voice. "This way." We moved quicker now, following the sound until we emerged on the bank of what had to be Reynolds Creek. But something was wrong. The creek we'd walked alongside that morning had been clear and cheerful, dancing over rounded stones in the sunlight. This water ran dark and sluggish between steep, muddy banks. "This can't be right," I said. Dylan had gone pale beneath his tan. "It's the same creek," he insisted. "It must look different here because of the terrain." But we all knew that wasn't it. Somehow, we'd found a different waterway entirely, one not marked on our map. "We need to call for help," Melissa said, pulling out her phone. "No signal," she confirmed what we already suspected. "If we follow the water downstream," Dylan suggested, "we'll eventually reach a road or a campsite. Water always leads to civilization." It was as good a plan as any. We began making our way along the creek bank, which proved difficult going. There was no path here, just slippery mud and tangled underbrush. The trees pressed close to the water's edge, their roots sometimes forcing us to climb over or detour around them. As we struggled forward, I became aware of an unpleasant odor, subtle at first, then increasingly pervasive. A dank, rotting smell that seemed to emanate from the dark water. "What is that?" Melissa asked, covering her nose with her sleeve. "Probably just stagnant pools or dead vegetation," Dylan said, but he didn't sound convinced. The smell grew stronger as we continued downstream, until it became almost unbearable. A miasma of decay that seemed to cling to our clothing and skin. Then, rounding a bend in the creek, we saw the source. A deer carcass lay half submerged in the water, wedged against a fallen tree. But this was no ordinary case of natural death. The animal had been split open from throat to tail, its ribcage splayed outward like grotesque wings. The internal organs were missing entirely, leaving a hollow cavity washed clean by the creek water. Melissa turned away, retching. Even Dylan, with all his biology teacher's clinical detachment, looked shaken. "Something killed it," I stated the obvious, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Coyotes maybe, or a mountain lion," Dylan suggested without conviction. No predator I'd ever heard of dispatched its prey like this, with surgical precision rather than savage tearing. "We need to keep moving," he added after a moment. "We're losing light." He was right. The forest had grown perceptibly darker in the short time we'd been standing there. The sun must be setting, though we couldn't see the horizon through the dense canopy. We gave the deer carcass a wide berth and continued downstream, each of us lost in our own thoughts. No one mentioned what we'd seen, as if speaking about it might somehow make it more real. After another half hour of difficult progress, the creek widened and the banks became more navigable. I checked my watch again, 7:14 p.m. We still had about an hour of daylight left, assuming my watch was accurate. I was beginning to have doubts about everything. "Look," Melissa said suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the trees, perhaps 100 yards downstream, We could make out a structure of some kind. As we drew closer, my heart sank. It was the ruined cabin, the same one we'd visited earlier that day. Somehow, impossibly, we'd walked in a complete circle. "This can't be happening," Melissa whispered, voicing the fear we all felt. Dylan checked his compass again, tapping the glass as if expecting the needle to suddenly correct itself. "This doesn't make sense. We've been following the creek downstream the whole time." I approached the cabin, clearing slowly, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage. But it was solid enough. The same tumble-down walls, the same stone chimney pile, the same circle of stones at the edge of the meadow. Except now, as the daylight faded, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Inside the stone circle, the grass had withered and died, leaving a perfect ring of bare earth. "We need to get out of here," I said, a cold certainty settling over me. "Now." "It'll be dark soon," Dylan pointed out. We compromised. We would try one more time to find the main trail, but if we hadn't succeeded within 30 minutes, we'd return to the clearing for the night. This time, we set out in a different direction, ignoring the faint trails and instead following a straight line according to Dylan's compass. We pushed through dense underbrush, scrambled over fallen logs, and waded through patches of ferns that sometimes reached our waists. The forest was growing darker by the minute. Long shadows stretched between the trees, and the air had taken on a chill that penetrated our light hiking clothes. No one spoke as we pressed on, each step an act of desperate hope. 20 minutes into our renewed effort, we heard it, a sound that stopped us all in our tracks. From somewhere behind us came a long, drawn-out wail, not quite human, not quite animal. It rose in pitch until it hurt to listen, then abruptly cut off. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Melissa had gone sheet white. "Mountain lion, maybe?" But we all knew it wasn't a mountain lion. I'd heard recordings of their screams before. Unsettling as they were, they didn't sound like this. This was something else entirely. "Keep moving," Dylan urged, his voice tight with controlled fear. We quickened our pace, no longer concerned with maintaining a straight line, simply wanting to put distance between ourselves and whatever had made that sound. The forest floor began to slope upward, becoming rockier and more difficult to traverse in the failing light. The wail came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, as if surrounding us. "Run," Dylan said, and we did. We crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over rocks, and ducked under low-hanging branches. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding against my ribs. Behind us, the wailing continued intermittently, sometimes sounding farther away, sometimes terrifyingly close. We crested a rocky ridge and paused, gasping for breath. Looking back, I could see nothing moving among the trees, but the forest had grown so dark now that visibility was limited to a few dozen yards. "I think we lost it," Melissa said between breaths. As if in answer, a figure emerged from between the trees at the base of the ridge. In the dimming light, I could make out only its silhouette, unnaturally tall and thin, moving with a jerky, lurching gait. It stopped and seemed to look up at us, though I couldn't distinguish any features that might have been a face. "Go," Dylan urged, his voice a harsh whisper. "Go now." We turned and continued up the ridge, climbing as fast as the treacherous footing would allow. The slope grew steeper, the rocks looser. Melissa slipped once, crying out as she skinned her palm on sharp stone. I helped her up, glancing back down the ridge. The figure was climbing now, moving with unnatural speed despite its awkward gait. "Don't look," I told her, "just climb." At the top of the ridge, the forest opened onto a plateau of sorts, and there, like a beacon in the gathering darkness, was a clearly marked trail with a wooden signpost. "Reynolds Creek Trail, 0.5 miles to junction," Dylan read aloud, his voice cracking with relief. We made it. But our relief was short-lived. From just below the ridge came that terrible wailing again, followed by the sound of loose rocks skittering down the slope. Whatever was pursuing us hadn't given up. We ran along the trail, no longer caring about pace or conservation of energy. All that mattered was putting distance between ourselves and the thing behind us. The trail was wide and well-maintained here, allowing us to move quickly even in the deepening twilight. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes, we reached the promised junction. The main trail stretched before us, and there, wonderfully familiar, was the sound of Reynolds Creek, the real Reynolds Creek, burbling over stones. "Left or right?" Melissa gasped. Dylan pointed left. "Downstream, back to the lake." We turned onto the main trail and continued our flight. The forest was almost fully dark now, but the sky above the creek bed still held some light, enough to see our way. Behind us, the wailing had stopped, but I could sense rather than hear something moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us just beyond the line of trees. "Almost there," Dylan encouraged as we rounded a bend and the trees began to thin. The lake should be just ahead. And then, like a nightmare suddenly dispelled, we emerged from the forest. Before us lay Deerfield Lake, its surface reflecting the last purple light of dusk. And there, a quarter-mile along the shore, was our campsite. Tent silhouettes just visible, the lake water gently lapping nearby. We crossed the remaining distance at a stumbling jog, our legs leaden with exhaustion. As we reached the edge of our sight, I looked back at the forest we'd just escaped. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line. A tall, thin shadow darker than the gathering night around it. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest like mist. We didn't discuss what had happened as we built up the fire and huddled around it, eating cold granola bars because none of us had the energy or inclination to cook. Dylan's confident outdoorsman demeanor had vanished, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He kept feeding branches into the fire, building it higher than necessary. "We should leave in the morning," Melissa finally said, breaking the silence. "Pack up and go home." Dylan nodded without argument. I think we were all beyond arguing at that point. I volunteered for the first watch, though none of us had explicitly agreed that someone should stay awake. It simply felt necessary. Melissa and Dylan retreated to their respective tents around 10, leaving me alone by the fire. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above the dark silhouette of the hills. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now, every shadow beyond the firelight's reach seemed to conceal potential threats. Every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Around midnight, I heard it again. That inhuman wailing, distant but unmistakable. It came from across the lake, echoing off the hills before fading into silence. I stared into the darkness, straining to see any movement along the far shore, but there was nothing visible. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I woke with a start to find the fire burning low. The night around me was silent except for the gentle lapping of lake water and the occasional pop from the dying embers. Something felt wrong. I looked around, trying to identify what had disturbed me. Our two tents stood as before, dark and still in the faint firelight. Wait. 2 tents? There should have been only one other tent besides the one I shared with Melissa. Dylan's tent. But now there were 2 additional shelters, identical to ours, set up on the far side of the campsite. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was still half asleep and seeing things. But the extra tents remained solidly, undeniably there. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept toward Dylan's tent and whispered his name. After a moment, the zipper lowered and his face appeared, eyes wide with alarm. "There are 2 more tents," I said, my voice barely audible. "Over there." He emerged fully from his tent and stared across the campsite. "What the hell?" he breathed. "Should we check them?" I suggested, not wanting to but feeling we had to know. Dylan nodded grimly. We approached the nearest of the mysterious tents, Dylan picking up a heavy branch as a makeshift weapon. With trembling fingers, I reached for the zipper and pulled it down inch by inch. The tent was empty. Not just unoccupied, but completely empty. No sleeping bags, no backpacks, nothing to indicate anyone had ever used it. The same proved true of the second tent. "This is impossible," Dylan whispered. "These weren't here when we returned. I would have noticed." "We need to leave," I said. "Now. Wake Melissa. I'll start packing." We worked quickly and silently, breaking down our real tents and gathering our supplies. Melissa said nothing when we explained, just nodded and helped with the packing. Within 20 minutes, we had everything loaded into Dylan's Jeep and my car. As we prepared to leave, I looked back at our abandoned campsite. The two mysterious tents still stood there, dark and uninviting in the faint pre-dawn light. Beyond them, at the edge of the forest, I thought I glimpsed movement, something tall and thin watching from the trees. "Don't look back," Melissa said, tugging at my arm. "Just drive." We made it back to Sioux Falls as the sun was rising. None of us spoke much during the long drive. What was there to say? We had experienced something that defied explanation, something that didn't belong in the orderly world of spreadsheets and scheduling and normal life. Dylan dropped us off at our apartment, declined our offer to come in for coffee, and drove away with a promise to call later. I don't think any of us believed he would. Some experiences create bonds between people. Others drive wedges that can never be removed. Melissa and I took long, hot showers and crawled into bed, pulling the blinds against the morning light. We slept fitfully, waking often to assure ourselves we were safe, that we were home. Later that afternoon, I went to pour myself a glass of water from the kitchen tap and noticed something on my hand, a mark on my palm I hadn't seen before, a perfect circle about the size of a dime, the skin within it slightly darker than the surrounding area, as if stained or bruised. "Melissa," I called, my voice shaking, "look at this." She came into the kitchen, examined my palm, and then, wordlessly, held out her own hand. There, on her palm, was an identical mark, a circle of discolored skin. "What does it mean?" she whispered. I had no answer for her. But that night, and many nights since, I've dreamed of a stone circle in a forest clearing, of withered grass and dark water running over bleached bones. And, in the dreams, something watches from just beyond the trees, something tall and thin and patient. Sometimes, when I wake from these dreams, I think I hear a distant wailing, like something calling from very far away, or perhaps calling something else to me. I don't go camping anymore. I don't hike in forests or venture anywhere I can't see the horizon in all directions. I've moved back to the plains, where the land is flat and open and there are no shadows tall enough to walk upright. But the mark on my palm remains, a perfect circle that neither fades nor changes. And sometimes when I look at it too long, I swear I can hear that sound again, that horrible, inhuman wailing, as if it's coming from inside the mark itself, as if something is trying to get out, or perhaps trying to get in. My name is Carol King, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Black Hills National Forest, South Dakota, just 3 months ago. I've always believed that nature has a way of healing broken people. After my divorce was finalized and the custody battle left me with only weekend visits to my daughter, I needed that healing desperately. As a high school English teacher with summers off, I decided to use my newfound and unwanted freedom to tackle a section of the Centennial Trail in the Black Hills. I'd heard it was challenging but rewarding. 110 miles of rugged terrain with views that could make you forget your troubles. The irony isn't lost on me now. I went into those woods to forget. Instead, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to forget what happened there. Day 1 started at the trailhead near Bear Butte, a sacred site to the Lakota people. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of ponderosa pines. My backpack felt comfortably heavy against my shoulders, filled with enough supplies for a 7-day journey. I planned to average about 15 miles per day, a bit ambitious for a weekend hiker like me, but I craved the exhaustion. Physical pain seemed preferable to the emotional kind. The first 10 miles went smoothly. The terrain was challenging but beautiful. Rolling hills covered in pine forests, wildflowers dotting the undergrowth. I passed a few day hikers and a couple on horseback, but by mid-afternoon, I was blissfully alone. As the sun began to set, I set up camp in a small clearing about 50 yards from the trail. The process of pitching my tent and preparing a simple meal over my portable stove felt meditative. For the first time in months, the constant chatter in my mind, the arguments with my ex, the teary goodbyes with my daughter, the whispers of failure, quieted to a tolerable hum. That night I slept better than I had since the divorce proceedings began. Dawn broke with a gentle mist hanging between the pines. I made coffee and oatmeal, packed up, and hit the trail by 7 a.m. The day's hike took me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew taller and the spaces between them narrower. The trail climbed steadily upward, then descended into a valley where a stream cut through the land. That's where I met her. She was sitting on a large rock beside the stream, her hiking boots off and feet dangling in the water. A German shepherd lay beside her, tongue lolling contentedly. She looked to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and laugh lines around her eyes. "Good morning," she called as I approached. "Perfect day for a hike, isn't it?" Her name was Marie Burton, and her dog was Scout. She'd been hiking the Black Hills for decades, she told me, and knew these trails better than the lines on my own palm. We shared trail mix and stories as we rested by the stream. She was heading north while I was going south, but she offered advice about the path ahead. "Watch yourself when you get to Elk Creek," she warned. "There's an old homestead about a mile east of the trail. Local folks don't go near it. Bad history." When I asked what she meant, Marie hesitated, then shrugged. "Just stories. Every patch of wilderness has them. But I'd camp at least a mile away from there, if I were you." We parted ways after about 30 minutes. I continued south, feeling mysteriously lighter after our brief encounter. It wasn't until I made camp that evening that I realized I'd never told Marie which direction I was heading. The third day brought clouds and a damp chill that seeped through my layers. The terrain grew more difficult, steep climbs followed by treacherous descents, the trail sometimes nearly disappearing among rocks and roots. By mid-afternoon, rain began to fall in earnest, and I knew I needed to find shelter soon. According to my map, I was approaching Elk Creek. I remembered Marie's warning and tried to gauge how far east the old homestead might be. The rain was coming down harder now, reducing visibility, and I was soaked through despite my rain gear. When I spotted a dilapidated wooden structure through the trees, about 100 yards off the trail, I hesitated. But thunder rumbled overhead, and my options were limited. Surely Marie's warning was just local superstition, and even if not, shelter was shelter. I left the trail and made for the building. It was an old cabin, much of its roof intact despite the obvious age of the structure. A rusted windmill creaked slowly beside it, and what must have once been a garden was now an overgrown tangle of weeds. I approached cautiously, calling out a hello in case some other hiker had taken refuge there. No answer came. The door hung crookedly on leather hinges. I pushed it open, wincing at the groan it gave. The interior was a single room, dark and musty. Rain pattered through small holes in the roof, creating puddles on the warped wooden floor. An ancient iron stove stood in one corner, a bed frame with a rotted mattress in another. A table and single chair completed the sparse furnishings. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than pitching a tent in the thunderstorm. I dropped my pack and began to explore the cabin more thoroughly. There were shelves with a few rusted tins and glass jars filled with unidentifiable substances. A trunk at the foot of the bed was locked, and I decided not to force it open. Above the stove, something caught my eye. Words had been carved into the wall, the letters crude but readable. "They come at night. Don't let them in. They wear familiar faces." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. Kids playing pranks, I told myself. Or maybe some horror movie fan marking their passage. Still, I couldn't help glancing at the door, relieved to see it had a sturdy wooden bar that could be dropped into metal brackets on either side. I changed into dry clothes and ate a cold dinner, not wanting to risk lighting a fire in the ancient stove. As daylight faded, the rain continued unabated. Wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag on the floor, as far from the leaks as possible, and tried to read with my headlamp. But the words from the wall kept floating back into my mind. They were familiar faces. Sleep came fitfully. Each time I dozed off, some noise would jerk me awake. The creak of the windmill, the scrabble of what might have been a rodent in the walls, the persistent drip of rainwater. During one such awakening, I noticed the rain had stopped. Moonlight filtered through the grimy window, casting long shadows across the floor. And then I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer perhaps, or even a black bear, but the rhythm was unmistakably human. Someone was slowly circling the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped at the door. I held my breath, eyes fixed on the wooden bar securing it closed. "Carol?" a voice called softly. A woman's voice. "Carol, are you in there?" My blood turned to ice. It was Marie's voice. "Marie?" I called back, my voice cracking. "What are you doing here? I thought you were heading north." "I was worried about you in this storm," she replied. "Can you let me in? Scout and I are soaked through." Something felt wrong. Marie had been heading in the opposite direction. Even if she'd changed her mind, how could she possibly know I was here, in this specific cabin off the trail? And I'd been awake just moments before. I would have heard her and Scout approaching through the wet undergrowth. "Carol?" Marie's voice took on an edge. "Let me in. It's not safe out here." I stayed silent, heart hammering so loudly I was sure she could hear it through the door. "Let me in, Carol." The voice was Marie's, but the tone had changed completely. Lower, guttural, wrong. The door handle rattled violently. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the wall, unable to tear my eyes from the door. The wooden bar held as the door shuddered under impact. Whatever was outside was throwing its weight against it. "Let me in." The voice was no longer trying to sound like Marie. It was deep and distorted, more animal than human. The assaults on the door continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing. After several minutes, I crept forward, pressing my ear to the door. Nothing. Had it gone? I didn't dare open the door to check. A scratching sound from the window made me whirl around. Through the grimy glass, I could make out a silhouette, a human form, but wrong somehow, the proportions subtly distorted. As I watched in horror, it pressed what might have been a face against the glass. In the moonlight, I could see familiar features trying to arrange themselves into Marie's kind smile. But the skin seemed to shift and flow, unable to maintain the deception from this angle. The eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. I screamed then. I couldn't help it. The thing at the window jerked back at the sound, then began to methodically tap on the glass with what looked like a human finger, but bent at an impossible angle. Tap, tap, tap. I retreated to the farthest corner of the cabin, dragging my sleeping bag with me. I found my hiking knife and gripped it tightly, though I knew instinctively it would be useless against whatever was outside. The tapping continued all night, moving from window to door and back again. Sometimes it would call out in Marie's voice, then my ex-husband's, then, most terribly, my daughter's. "Mommy, why won't you let me in? I'm scared, Mommy." I pressed my hands over my ears and rocked back and forth, telling myself it wasn't real. Couldn't be real. When dawn finally came, the tapping stopped. I waited until full light before approaching the window. Nothing was there. No footprints in the mud, no sign of disturbance. Had I imagined it all? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress? I packed my things with shaking hands, determined to get back to the trail and civilization as quickly as possible. As I shouldered my backpack, my gaze fell on the carved warning again. They wear familiar faces. The fourth day of my hike was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every bird call sounded momentarily like a human voice. I pushed myself hard, covering nearly 20 miles despite the difficult terrain. I wanted distance between myself and that cabin. By evening, I was nearing Sheridan Lake, where I knew there was a campground with facilities and, most importantly, other people. My muscles screamed in protest as I climbed the final ridge before the descent to the lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in pinks and oranges that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. At the top of the ridge, I paused to catch my breath. The valley stretched out below me, Sheridan Lake gleaming in the distance. Relief washed over me at the sight. Just another hour of hiking, and I'd be safe among other campers. That's when I saw her again. Marie was about 50 yards ahead on the trail, her back to me, Scout sitting obediently at her side. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, unsure what to do. Could it really be her? Or was it the thing that had tried to trick me at the cabin? As if sensing my presence, Marie turned. She smiled and waved, apparently unsurprised to see me. "Carol, I thought you might be behind me. How was your hike?" I remained where I was, poised to run if necessary. "What are you doing here, Marie? You were heading north." Her smile didn't falter. "Changed my mind. Thought I'd loop back south and enjoy Sheridan Lake for a few days." She gestured toward the distant water. "Are you heading there too? We could share a campsite." Everything about her seemed normal. Her voice, her mannerisms, the way Scout wagged his tail lazily beside her. And yet... "Were you at an old cabin near Elk Creek last night?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Marie's brow furrowed. "The Hanson homestead." "No, I told you to stay away from there. Did you go there?" When I didn't answer, concern crossed her face. "Carol, did something happen?" I hesitated. If this was really Marie, I'd sound insane telling her about the night before. If it wasn't Marie, I didn't want to reveal what I knew. "Bad dreams," I said finally. "The storm was rough." Marie nodded sympathetically, but something flickered in her eyes. Something knowing. "Storms can bring bad things in these hills," she said. "Best to keep moving when they come." She turned and continued down the trail, Scout trotting beside her. After a moment's hesitation, I followed, keeping a distance of about 20 yards between us. I kept my hiking poles gripped tightly, ready to use them as weapons if necessary. We reached the campground as the last light was fading from the sky. Marie headed for the check-in station, waving for me to follow. I did, reluctantly. The campground host was a weathered man in his 60s named Tom, who greeted Marie by name. "Back again, Marie? Thought you were heading up to Bear Butte this time." "Change of plans," she said cheerfully. "This is Carol. We met on the trail." Tom nodded at me, his expression friendly. "Welcome to Sheridan Lake. Got plenty of spots open this time of year. You two camping together?" Before I could say no, Marie answered, "If Carol doesn't mind the company, and Scout's very well behaved." Put on the spot, I found myself nodding stiffly. Tom assigned us a campsite at the edge of the campground, relatively private but still within shouting distance of other campers. As we walked there, I tried to rationalize my fear. If Tom knew Marie, she must be a regular. The thing at the cabin had just been a terrible nightmare. Or perhaps a local trying to scare the tourist. Our campsite had a fire pit, a picnic table, and enough flat ground for 2 tents. Marie efficiently set up her small backpacking tent while I did the same with mine, positioning it so that hers wasn't between me and the path back to the main campground. "I'm going to get cleaned up," Marie announced, grabbing a small toiletry bag. "The shower house is decent here. Want to come?" I shook my head. The thought of being in a small enclosed space with her made my skin crawl, despite my attempts at rationality. "I'll go later. I want to rest for a bit." Marie shrugged. "Suit yourself. Scout, stay." The dog settled on a blanket beside her tent, watching me with intelligent eyes as Marie disappeared down the path. I sat at the picnic table, watching Scout. The dog seemed perfectly normal, no signs of agitation or wrongness that might indicate his owner wasn't who she appeared to be. After a few minutes, I cautiously approached him, hand extended. "Hey there, Scout. You're a good boy, aren't you?" The dog sniffed my hand, then licked it, tail wagging. I scratched behind his ears, studying him. His collar had tags, a rabies vaccination tag and an ID tag with Marie's name and what I assumed was her home phone number. Impulsively, I took out my phone. No service, of course. But I snapped a quick picture of the tag with Marie's information. If nothing else, it would help me verify her identity later when I was safely back in civilization. Marie returned about 15 minutes later, her hair damp. "Showers are all yours if you want them," she said. "I'm going to start dinner. Hope you don't mind sharing? I've got more than enough." The normalcy of the situation was beginning to ease my paranoia. We ate a simple meal of rehydrated stew that Marie prepared over a small camp stove. Scout lay between us, occasionally raising his head hopefully when meat was mentioned. The conversation was casual, mostly Marie telling stories about previous hikes in the Black Hills. "Did you ever hear about the Thompson family?" she asked as we finished eating. The abrupt change in topic put me on edge. "No. Who were they?" Marie leaned forward, her face lit eerily from below by the small lantern on the table. Family that went missing in these hills back in the 1970s. Mother, father, 2 kids. They were camping not far from here. One morning, another camper noticed their tent was slashed open from the inside. Their car was still there, all their belongings. They were just gone. I swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" Marie shrugged. "No one knows for sure. Search parties combed these hills for weeks. Found nothing." She paused, studying my face. "There have been other disappearances over the years. Mostly hikers going solo. Some say it's mountain lions or bears, others blame exposure or accidents. But there are older stories." "What kind of stories?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The Dakota have legends about shapeshifters, beings that can take human form to lure travelers away from safety." Marie's voice had dropped to a near whisper. "They call them skinwalkers in some tribes, and the Lakota have different names for them. But the stories all say the same thing. They're most dangerous when they take the form of someone you trust." A chill ran down my spine. "You're trying to scare me." Marie laughed, the sound too loud in the quiet campground. "Just sharing some local folklore. Don't worry, I don't think there's been a disappearance around here for at least 5 years." That night, I lay awake in my tent, listening to Marie's slow, steady breathing from her tent a few yards away. Scout occasionally whimpered in his sleep, paws twitching as he dreamed of chasing something. Or being chased. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke with a start to complete silence. No breathing from Marie's tent, no rustling of Scout on his blanket. The night was unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling. A shadow fell across my tent, someone standing between me and the distant campground lights, a silhouette that was approximately human-shaped, but somehow wrong in ways my mind couldn't fully process. "Carol," Marie's voice whispered, "are you awake? I need to show you something." I lay perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. "I know you're awake, Carol. I can hear your heart beating." The voice was Marie's, and yet, not. It had the same subtle wrongness as the silhouette, almost right, but with something terrible lurking underneath. The zipper of my tent began to move slowly upward. I lunged for it, yanking it back down and fumbling with the small lock. The shadow outside shook my tent violently. "Let me in. Carol." The thing with Marie's voice growled, lower now, distorted. "Let me in." I screamed for help, hoping the other campers would hear. The thing outside laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "They can't hear you," it said. "They're asleep. They're all asleep." The tent fabric began to tear as something sharp sliced through it. I grabbed my hiking knife and backpedaled to the far side of the small space, holding the blade out in front of me. A hand pushed through the tear. At least, it had the approximate shape of a hand. The fingers were too long, the joints too numerous. The skin seemed to ripple and shift in the darkness. Then, Scout barked. A real, normal dog bark from the direction of Marie's tent. The hand withdrew immediately. I heard a low growl that was neither human nor canine, followed by the sound of Scout's continued barking turning into a pained yelp. Terrified but unwilling to let the dog face the thing alone, I unzipped my tent and stumbled out. The campsite was washed in pale moonlight. Scout was standing defensively in front of Marie's closed tent, hackles raised, bleeding from a gash on his shoulder. Facing him was something. In the moonlight, it looked almost like Marie. It had her general size and shape, her silver-streaked hair. But as it moved, the illusion slipped. Its movements were too fluid, joints bending in impossible ways. Its face, when it turned toward me, was Marie's face seen through a funhouse mirror, features sliding and reforming, never quite settling. Scout lunged at it, teeth bared. The thing hissed, a sound no human throat could make, and lashed out with one distorted arm. The dog yelped again but held his ground. I stood frozen, knife clutched uselessly in my hand. The thing's attention was now split between me and Scout. It cocked its head at an impossible angle, studying me with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. "Pretty, Carol," it said in Marie's voice, grotesquely wrong coming from that shifting face. "So full of fear. Fear makes the meat sweeter." It took a step toward me. Scout charged it again, this time sinking his teeth into what should have been its leg. The thing screeched, a high, piercing sound that made my ears ring, and tried to shake the dog off. Taking advantage of the distraction, I ran, not toward the main campground, which suddenly seemed miles away, but toward Marie's tent. I had to know if she was in there, if she was alive. I tore open the zipper and thrust my headlamp inside. The tent was empty. No Marie, no sleeping bag, no backpack. It was completely bare, as if no one had ever set it up. Behind me, Scout yelped one final time, then fell silent. I turned to see the thing standing over the dog's motionless body, its form rippling and changing. As I watched in horror, it seemed to absorb something from Scout, some essence that flowed from the dog into the creature. When it straightened, its form had stabilized somewhat. It looked more like Marie now, but still wrong. The eyes too wide, the smile too wide, teeth too numerous. "Where is Marie?" I managed to ask, my voice a terrified whisper. The thing's smile widened impossibly further. "Marie Burton from Spearfish? She was delicious. Met her 3 days ago, near that stream where you had your little chat." It tapped its chest. "I wear her well, don't you think? Almost had you fooled." My mind raced. I was alone with this thing at the edge of the campground. If I screamed, would anyone hear? Would they arrive in time? As if reading my thoughts, the creature said, "Don't bother calling for help. Tom is indisposed, and the other campers won't wake until morning. By then, I'll be wearing your skin. Carol King from Rapid City." It knew my full name. My hometown. How much of my mind had it read during our conversations? The thing began to move toward me with that unnatural fluidity. I backed away, bumping into the picnic table. My hand closed around the lantern Marie, the thing, had used earlier. Without thinking, I hurled it at the creature. The lantern struck it in the chest and exploded, showering the thing with burning fuel. It screamed, a sound of genuine pain and fury as flames engulfed its stolen form. The smell was horrific, not burning flesh but something else, something ancient and wrong. I didn't wait to see more. I ran toward the main campground, screaming for help. Behind me, the thing's inhuman shrieks continued, along with the crackling of flames as the fire spread to the tents. I reached the shower house, solid cinder block walls that might offer some protection, and locked myself inside. Through the small window, I could see the orange glow of the growing fire. Other campers were finally emerging from their tents, pointing and shouting. Did I dare join them? What if the thing had survived somehow? What if it was already wearing someone else's face, waiting for me? I huddled in the shower house until dawn, jumping at every sound. When full daylight came, I cautiously emerged. A small crowd had gathered around the charred remains of what had been my campsite. Fire trucks and ranger vehicles were parked nearby. I approached slowly, suddenly aware of how I must look, wild-eyed, covered in soot, clutching a knife. A park ranger spotted me and hurried over. "Ma'am, are you Carol King? We found your ID and what was left of your backpack." He looked concerned. "Are you injured?" I shook my head, unable to find words. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound insane? "Can you tell us what happened?" he pressed. "How did the fire start?" "An accident," I managed. "With a lantern. I was camping alone." The ranger frowned. "Alone?" "We found 2 tents. Both were mine," I lied. "One for sleeping, one for gear." He didn't look convinced, but didn't push it. "And the dog?" My heart sank. "Dog?" He gestured toward where a small group of people stood. "German Shepherd. Found it in the ashes. Dead before the fire, looks like. Some kind of attack. Throat torn out. Poor Scout." I felt a wave of grief for the loyal animal who had tried to protect me, and possibly his real owner, before I ever met them. "Not mine," I said truthfully. "Must have been a stray." The ranger studied me for a long moment, then nodded toward an ambulance parked nearby. "Why don't you get checked out? Then we'll need a full statement." The next few hours passed in a blur. The paramedics found no serious injuries, just minor burns and cuts. The police asked their questions, and I stuck to my story about camping alone and a lantern accident. They were skeptical. The fire had clearly started in 2 separate locations, but had no evidence to suggest anything criminal. No one mentioned finding human remains other than Scout's body. Whatever the thing had been, it either escaped or left no recognizable traces when it burned. They drove me back to my car at Bear Butte Trailhead. Before I left, I asked the ranger about Marie Burton from Spearfish. "Marie Burton?" he repeated, frowning. "Name sounds familiar." "She hikes these trails a lot," I said. "Silver hair, usually with a German Shepherd named Scout." Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Oh, you mean old Marie? Yeah, she was a regular around here." He shifted uncomfortably. "She went missing about 5 years ago. Big search, nothing ever found. Some hikers found her dog wandering alone on the trail, half-starved. Real sad case. 5 years. The thing had been wearing Marie's face, using her memories. For 5 years. I drove home in a daze, jumping at every shadow, suspicious of every stranger. I called in sick to work for a week, then took unpaid leave for the rest of the summer. I couldn't bear to be around people. Couldn't stop wondering if they were really who they appeared to be. I became obsessed with researching disappearances in the Black Hills. There were dozens over the decades, most attributed to accidents or exposure. But there were patterns if you knew to look for them. Clusters of disappearances every few years, often near Elk Creek or Sheridan Lake. I found an old newspaper article about the Hansen homestead, the cabin where I'd spent that terrible night. In 1887, the entire Hansen family was found dead inside, their bodies mutilated in ways the newspaper described only as too horrible to relate. The sole survivor, a cousin visiting from Norway, claimed they had been killed by something that came in the night wearing familiar faces. He was committed to an asylum, where he died still raving about shapeshifters. The carved warning in the cabin replays in my mind constantly. They wear familiar faces. Don't let them in. Is it still out there? wearing Marie's face? Or has it taken a new victim, a new disguise? Does it remember me? Is it patient enough to wait years, as it apparently did after taking Marie, before coming for me? I've moved away from South Dakota, changed my phone number. I hardly ever leave my apartment now. I've covered all the mirrors. I can't shake the fear that my reflection might start moving wrong, smiling too widely, blinking too slowly. The rational part of my mind says I experienced some kind of psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation, that none of it was real, that Marie was just another hiker, Scout just a dog, the fire just an accident. But I know what I saw. I know what tried to wear my skin. And sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear a soft tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. A voice that's almost, but not quite, my daughter's calls softly. "Mommy? Why won't you let me in? I'm scared, Mommy." I never answer. I never open the door. They wear familiar faces, you see, and they're patient. So patient. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Black Elk Peak in South Dakota, during what was supposed to be a weekend hiking trip to clear my head after my divorce. I never imagined that those dense ponderosa pine forests would become the backdrop for the most terrifying experience of my life. It started innocently enough. I'd always been an avid hiker, but the stress of the past year, losing both my job and my marriage in the span of 6 months, had kept me away from the trails. My therapist suggested reconnecting with nature might help with my anxiety, and Black Elk Peak seemed like the perfect destination. At 7,242 feet, it's the highest point east of the Rockies and west of the Pyrenees. I'd read about its breathtaking views and spiritual significance to the Lakota people. What I hadn't read about were the legends surrounding Harney Peak, as it was formerly known, legends of strange disappearances and inexplicable phenomena that the locals were reluctant to discuss. I arrived at the Sylvan Lake trailhead on a crisp Friday afternoon in late September. The tourist season was winding down, and I relished the idea of solitude. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a forest ranger's truck and a beat-up Subaru with South Dakota plates. As I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, a woman in a Forest Service uniform approached me. "Heading up to the peak?" she asked, her expression friendly but with something else behind her eyes that I couldn't quite place. "That's the plan," I replied. "Thought I'd camp at one of the backcountry sites for a couple of nights." She nodded slowly. "Just be sure to stay on the marked trails, especially after dark. We've had some incidents lately." "Incidents?" I asked, suddenly alert. "Oh, just some hikers getting turned around. Nothing serious." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The weather can change quickly up there this time of year, and the terrain can be disorienting after sunset. I assured her I was an experienced hiker with good equipment, and she seemed satisfied, though she hesitated before walking away. "One more thing," she said. "If you happen to run into an old man named Elijah Blackwood who says he's a guide, just keep moving. He's not actually park personnel." Before I could ask about this Elijah person, her radio crackled, and she hurried back to her truck. I shrugged off the odd interaction and set off on trail number 9 toward the peak, eager to leave civilization behind. The first few hours of hiking were blissful. The autumn air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Golden aspen leaves quivered in the gentle breeze, creating a kaleidoscope of light and shadow on the forest floor. Wildlife was abundant. Mule deer watching cautiously from clearings, red squirrels chattering indignantly as I passed. I even spotted a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, its distinctive cry echoing off the granite formations. By late afternoon, I'd made good progress and decided to set up camp at a small clearing about 2 miles from the summit. I'd finish the ascent in the morning, ensuring I'd have plenty of daylight for the return trip. The clearing was perfect. Relatively flat, with a small stream nearby and enough tree cover to provide shelter if the weather turned. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the earlier symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves replaced by a heavy silence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, standing among the trees, but there was never anything there, just shadows growing longer as the sun began its descent behind the peaks. Just paranoia, I muttered to myself, hammering the last tent stake into the ground with perhaps more force than necessary. This is why you came out here, Johnson, to get out of your own head. I busied myself gathering firewood, keeping within sight of my campsite. The ranger's warning about staying on marked trails echoed in my mind, though technically I wasn't far off the main path. As dusk settled over the forest, I got a small fire going and heated up my freeze-dried beef stew. The familiar routine of camping helped ease my anxiety, and I began to feel foolish about my earlier unease. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic whistling drifting through the trees. The tune was oddly familiar yet impossible to place, like a half-remembered song from childhood. I froze, spoonful of stew halfway to my mouth, and listened intently. The whistling drew closer, then suddenly stopped. I was about to call out when a figure emerged from the tree line. He was an elderly man, tall and gaunt, with a deeply lined face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His silver hair hung in long braids beneath a worn leather hat, and he carried a gnarled walking stick carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize. Despite the cooling temperature, he wore only a light flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. "Evening, traveler," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant for his thin frame. "Mind if I share your fire for a spell?" The ranger's warning about an old man named Elijah flashed through my mind, but I hesitated to send someone away as night approached. Besides, there was something compelling about him, a quiet dignity that put me at ease despite my initial reservations. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing to a flat rock across the fire. "I'm Robert." "Elijah," he said simply, confirming my suspicion. "Elijah Blackwood." My stomach tightened, but I maintained a neutral expression as he settled across from me. If he noticed my reaction to his name, he didn't show it. "Heading to the peak?" he asked, warming his weathered hands by the fire. I nodded. "Tomorrow morning. You know the area well?" A strange smile crossed his face. "Better than most. Been walking these hills for longer than you've been alive, I expect." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, as though he were sharing a private joke. I offered him some coffee, which he accepted gratefully, cradling the mug between his palms as if absorbing its warmth. "Beautiful country," I said, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Peaceful." Elijah's eyes reflected the dancing flames as he gazed into the fire. "Peaceful now, maybe, but these hills have seen their share of blood and suffering. The land remembers, you know." I shifted uncomfortably. "I heard this place is sacred to the Lakota." "Sacred to some, cursed to others." He took a sip of coffee. "Did you know they changed the name back from Harney Peak a few years ago? General Harney led the massacre at Blue Water Creek, killed over 80 Lakota people, mostly women and children." "I didn't know that," I admitted. "The Lakota call this place Hinhankaga, making of owls. They say the spirits of the dead sometimes take that form." He looked up at the darkening sky. "Might hear them tonight. They get restless when the veil thins." "The veil?" "Between worlds." Elijah's gaze returned to me, suddenly intense. "You came here seeking something, didn't you? Not just a view from the highest point." I felt exposed, as if this stranger could see right through me. Just needed to clear my head. "These hills have a way of giving people what they need," he said cryptically. "Not always what they want, mind you, but what they need." We sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between us. Despite the strangeness of our conversation, I found Elijah's presence oddly comforting. He seemed to belong here in a way I never would, a part of the landscape itself. Eventually, he drained the last of his coffee and stood with surprising agility for a man his age. I should be on my way. It's getting dark, I said, surprised. You have a camp nearby? That strange smile again. I'm never far from home in these hills. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, which he tossed to me. I caught it reflexively. A smooth stone, black as midnight, with a naturally occurring hole through its center. Keep this with you, he said. A hagstone. Good for seeing things as they truly are. Before I could thank him or ask what he meant, he turned and walked back into the forest. Within seconds, the darkness had swallowed him completely. I examined the stone in my palm, running my thumb over its polished surface. Holding it up to my eye, I peered through the hole but saw only the normal forest beyond. With a shrug, I tucked it into my pocket and went about preparing for bed. Sleep came fitfully that night. The temperature dropped more dramatically than the forecast had predicted, and a strange mist rolled in around midnight, dampening my sleeping bag despite the tense rainfly. But it wasn't the cold or damp that kept me awake. It was the sounds. It started with the owls, just as Elijah had said. Not the familiar hooting I'd heard on previous camping trips, but something more deliberate, almost like words in a language just beyond my comprehension. They seemed to be calling back and forth, having a conversation over my head as I lay rigidly in my sleeping bag. Then came the whistling, that same eerie, half-familiar tune Elijah had been whistling, but from multiple directions at once, moving through the forest around my tent. I told myself it was just the wind, but there was an intentionality to it that wind alone couldn't produce. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake from a thin sleep to complete silence. The owls had stopped. The whistling had ceased. Even the normal sounds of the forest, insects, rustling leaves, the distant murmur of the stream, were gone. The silence was absolute and profoundly wrong. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate steps circling my tent. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The steps came closer, then stopped directly beside my head. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I could see a tall shadow looming over me. Not a person. The proportions were all wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head oddly elongated. A low, rasping sound started up, like labored breathing or the rustling of dry leaves. Then a voice, if you could call it that, spoke directly above me. "Robert," it hissed, my name stretched and distorted as if being learned for the first time by a mouth not made for human speech. Robert Johnson. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed with terror. This couldn't be happening. I was dreaming, having a panic attack. Anything but this impossible reality. "Open your eyes, Robert," the voice commanded, now seeming to come from inside my own head. "See me." My hand clutched reflexively at my pocket, feeling the hard outline of the stone Elijah had given me. The hag stone. "Good for seeing things as they truly are," he'd said. Moving purely on instinct, I pulled out the stone and held it up to my eye, peering through the hole. I immediately wished I hadn't. Through the stone's aperture, I could see the creature clearly despite the tent between us. It had once been human, that much I could tell, but was horrifically transformed. Its skin was gray and mottled, hanging loosely in some places and stretched taut over impossibly elongated bones in others. The face retained just enough human features to make its wrongness all the more terrifying. Eyes sunken and milky, mouth stretched in a rictus grin revealing blackened teeth filed to points. But worst of all were the antlers, massive, many-pointed growths erupting from its skull, draped with tattered strips of what looked horribly like human skin. As I stared, frozen in horror, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if sensing my true sight. Its grin widened further than any human mouth should be capable of. "Found you," it said, voice clearer now, almost conversational despite its grating quality. Lost little Robert, so far from home. My paralysis broke. I scrambled backward in my sleeping bag, heart threatening to burst from my chest. The creature's hand, gray fingers unnaturally long and tipped with yellowed claws, pressed against the tent, the fabric dimpling inward. "Let me in, Robert," it crooned. "I can take the pain away. All the loneliness, the failure. Let me wear your skin for a while, and you'll never hurt again." "Get away from me." I finally found my voice, though it emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. The creature laughed, a horrible sound like bones breaking. "Oh, but I've been invited. You've been calling to me for months now, with all that delicious despair, like a beacon in the dark." With a sudden, violent movement, claws ripped through the tent fabric, slashing downward. I rolled aside just in time, grabbing my flashlight as a pitiful weapon. The beam caught the creature's face, and it hissed, recoiling slightly. That momentary distraction was all I needed. I lunged for the tent door, unzipping it with frantic fingers, and burst outside into the mist-shrouded night. Without thought for my belongings, I ran blindly toward where I thought the trail should be, the heavy footfalls of the creature pounding behind me. The forest was transformed by night and mist, familiar landmarks rendered alien and threatening. Tree branches clutched at me like skeletal hands. Roots seemed to rise up to trip me. I had no idea if I was heading toward the trail or deeper into the wilderness, driven only by the primal need to escape what pursued me. Behind me, the creature's movements crashed through the underbrush, sometimes seemingly right at my heels, other times distantly to my left or right, as if it were toying with me. All the while, that terrible whistling started up again, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish chase. Eventually, I broke through a line of trees into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood a circle of standing stones that I was certain hadn't been on any trail map or guide to the area. They looked ancient, their surfaces covered in lichen and carved with symbols similar to those on Elijah's walking stick. With the creature's footsteps closing in, I had no choice. I ran into the center of the stone circle, collapsing to my knees, gasping for breath. My legs were numb, my lungs burning. I couldn't run anymore. The footsteps stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. Through tear-blurred eyes, I saw the creature prowling the perimeter of the stone circle, its movements jerky and frustrated, like a predator confronting an unexpected barrier. "Clever boy," it snarled, no longer bothering to mimic a human voice. "Found sanctuary. But how long will you stay there? You have no food, no water, no shelter. When the sun rises, you'll convince yourself this was all a nightmare. You'll leave the circle, and I'll be waiting." It settled back on its haunches just beyond the stones, patient as only a predator can be. I knew with sick certainty that it was right. I couldn't stay in this circle forever. As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, a now familiar whistling drifted across the clearing. The creature's head snapped up, its antlers silhouetted against the mist like a grotesque crown. "Blackwood," it growled, the name like a curse on its twisted lips. Elijah emerged from the trees opposite the creature, walking with the same unhurried confidence I'd seen earlier. In the moonlight, he looked different, younger somehow, his back straighter, his movements more fluid. The symbols on his walking stick glowed with a faint blue light. "Evening, Wendigo," Elijah said calmly, as if greeting an unpleasant neighbor. "Hunting out of season again, I see." The creature, a wendigo apparently, rose to its full, terrible height, easily 7 feet tall. "This doesn't concern you, old man. The marked one called to me. Fair prey." "He's under my protection now," Elijah replied, moving to stand between the wendigo and the stone circle. "You have no claim here." The wendigo let out a bone-chilling screech of frustration. "I smelled his despair across state lines. His soul is already half mine." "Yet he found the courage to run," Elijah said, a note of satisfaction in his voice, "and the wisdom to seek sanctuary." He glanced back at me. "Isn't that right, Robert?" I nodded numbly, still struggling to process what I was witnessing. The wendigo paced agitatedly, its movements becoming more animal-like by the second. "You can't guard him forever, Blackwood. Even you must sleep." "Perhaps," Elijah conceded, "but dawn is coming, and we both know you're weaker in daylight." He raised his staff, and the blue glow intensified. "Besides, I'm not alone." As if on cue, a chorus of hooting erupted from the surrounding forest. The same owls I'd heard earlier, but now, through the hagstone which I still clutched desperately in my hand, I could see them for what they truly were: spectral figures, vaguely human in shape but with owls' heads perched in the trees all around us, their eyes glowing with the same blue light as Elijah's staff. The wendigo snarled in frustration but began backing away. "This isn't over. He'll leave these hills eventually, and his despair will call to me again." "That will be his choice," Elijah said firmly. "For now, be gone." With a final screech of rage, the wendigo turned and loped away into the forest, its ungainly form quickly disappearing into the mist and darkness. Only when it was completely gone did Elijah approach the stone circle. "You can come out now, Robert. You're safe for the moment." On legs that threatened to give way beneath me, I stumbled out of the circle. What was that thing? What's happening?" "That was a wendigo," Elijah said grimly. "Ancient spirit of hunger and winter. Feeds on despair and human flesh. Your pain called to it. Your divorce, losing your job, made you a beacon to things that hunger for suffering." "How do you know about my divorce?" I asked, another wave of fear washing over me. Elijah's expression softened slightly. "The hills showed me. They show me what I need to know to protect them and those who pass through." "And you? What are you?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "A guardian," he said simply. "Been watching over these hills for a long time. The ranger warned me about you," I blurted out. "She told me to avoid you." Elijah chuckled. "Melissa's heart is in the right place. She thinks I'm just a harmless old kook who might lead tourists astray. Better that than knowing what really hunts these woods." Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the mist taking on a pearly glow. As the light grew stronger, I could see the stone circle more clearly, and realized with a shock that there was nothing there at all, just an ordinary clearing with a few scattered boulders. Elijah noticed my confusion. "The old ways hide themselves from daylight eyes," he said, "but they're still there if you know how to look." He nodded toward the hagstone still clutched in my hand. "I don't understand any of this," I said, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming me. "You don't need to," Elijah replied, "but you do need to decide what happens next. The wendigo's right about one thing. It'll be drawn to you now that it's had your scent. You can leave these hills and hope it doesn't follow, or what?" I prompted when he trailed off. "Or you can stay. Learn the old ways. Learn to fight your own battles instead of running from them." His eyes held mine, searching. "That despair you carry. It'll attract worse things than wendigos if you don't deal with it." "Stay? Where? How?" The idea seemed absurd, and yet some part of me resonated with his words. "I have a cabin," he said. "It's not much, but there's an extra bunk. Been looking for an apprentice for some time now." He gestured at the lightening forest. "This land needs more guardians than just one old man." I looked around at the forest, which seemed so ordinary in the growing daylight. Had last night really happened? The slashed remnants of my tent, somewhere back at my abandoned campsite, suggested it had. The weight of the hagstone in my palm confirmed it. "Why me?" I finally asked. "The hills choose," Elijah said with a shrug. "Not me. They saw something in you worth saving." He turned and began walking toward a barely visible trail. "Come on. You need food and rest before you decide anything. My cabin's not far." I hesitated only a moment before following him. What choice did I really have? My expensive camping gear was probably shredded. My car was miles away, and somewhere in these hills, a monster that knew my name was waiting for me to let down my guard. As we walked, The rising sun burned away the last of the mist, revealing an autumn morning of startling beauty. Birds returned to the trees, their songs reclaiming the forest. If not for the hagstone in my pocket and the memory of that grotesque, antlered silhouette, I might have convinced myself it had all been a nightmare born of anxiety and isolation. "The wendigo," I said as we walked, breaking a long silence. It said I was marked. What did that mean? Elijah glanced sideways at me. Some people carry their wounds on the outside, others on the inside. Yours are deep enough to be visible to those with eyes to see. A beacon in the dark, like it said. And learning these old ways, that would help? Might, he allowed. Can't promise it'll fix what's broken in you. That's your work to do, but it might give you purpose. And purpose is a powerful ward against despair. We crested a small rise, and Elijah's cabin came into view, a sturdy structure of log and stone that looked like it had grown organically from the hillside itself. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a small garden of herbs and vegetables occupied a sunny patch beside a clear spring. "Home?" Elijah said, a note of pride in his voice. "For now, at least yours, too, if you want it." Standing there in the morning light, looking at this unexpected sanctuary, I felt something stir within me that I hadn't experienced in months. A sense of possibility. The wendigo had been right about one thing. I had been lost. But perhaps being lost had led me exactly where I needed to be. "I want to learn," I heard myself say. "Teach me the old ways." Elijah nodded, satisfaction and something like relief crossing his weathered face. "The hills will be pleased," he said. "They've been waiting for you, Robert Johnson." As he spoke my name, an owl called from the forest behind us, a single, clear note that echoed across the valley like a welcome. Or perhaps a warning. In these ancient hills, I was beginning to understand. They might well be the same thing. I followed Elijah toward the cabin, the hagstone a reassuring weight in my pocket. Behind us, watching from the shadow of a lightning-struck pine, a gaunt figure with 2 long limbs and the suggestion of antlers melted back into the forest. Patient, waiting, hungry. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was no longer afraid.